Okay, good morning, everyone. I'd like to introduce myself as State Senator Tony Avella. I'm the ranking member of the Environmental Conservation Committee of the Senate, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Senate Democratic Conference to our public forum on hydrofracking. And I can't think of a better forum that we could hold on Earth Day Lobbying Day. The Senate Democratic Conference has made the issue of hydrofracking one of its top priorities. And I would like to personally thank the Minority Leader, Senator Sampson, and my other Democratic Conference colleagues for the leadership and support on this issue. The forum was scheduled after I and my colleagues requested that the Senate Republican majority hold a public hearing on several of the hydrofracking bills that are currently pending before the Senate. We were advised by the majority that a public hearing would not be held, but that the Democratic Conference was entitled to hold a public forum. While I am disheartened that our colleagues across the aisle have refused to actively participate in this important and long overdue discourse, I and my Democratic colleagues here today look forward to hearing each of your testimonies. We are joined today by farm owners, members of local government, doctors, nurses, scientists, economists, and everyday citizens who are concerned about this practice. We will be listening to each of you, and at the end of the day, I will call on Governor Cuomo and DEC Commissioner Martins to pause in their deliberations and take full measure of the risks versus the benefits of this so-called gold rush industry, as you will set them out today and make the right decision for this state for generations to come. I have repeatedly said that practice of high-volume hydrofracking poses the single most important environmental issue that has come before our state in the last 100 years, and the impact, if we do move ahead on this, we could live with for the next 1,000 years. And we must get this issue right. And just so everybody knows what my personal opinion is, I don't believe we should be doing hydrofracking, period. Now, first, I'd like to introduce my colleagues and ask them to say a few words. And first and foremost is the Minority Leader of the Democratic Conference, Senator Sampson, who I can't tell you how much support he has given me on this issue. And he's really been a leader within the entire legislature on the hydrofracking issue. Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Senator Avella. I want to thank you for your leadership on this issue, and also acknowledge my other colleagues, Senator Perkins from Harlem, and also Senator Dabo from Queens, who have been very instrumental in dealing with this issue. And brothers and sisters and ladies and gentlemen, when you talk about the issue of hydrofracking, this has become increasingly polarized, and our conference wants to ensure that the government's actions are based on facts and information and not on alarmist rhetoric or unfounded speculations. Once again, taxpayers are being asked by the energy industry to believe their drilling practices are safe and clean. But we need to look no further than the recent events, what happened with respect to BP in the Gulf of Mexico, and recognize the importance of fully understanding the impact of drilling before breaking ground. Without a thoughtful and comprehensive study of hydrofracking, access to clean, drinkable water will be in jeopardy, and the health of millions are at risk. And ladies and gentlemen, this is unacceptable to us and should be unacceptable to everyone. We want jobs like everybody else wants jobs, but to what expense are we willing to go? Are we willing to sacrifice and harm our health, but most of all, harm the environment? As legislators, we have a responsibility to not only serve the public, but to also truly understand the impact government measures will have on New Yorkers before we take action. Before we decide whether to provide authorization for companies to drill here in New York State, we must have the information about the long-term health and economic impacts this process will have, and this forum will provide us with greater understanding of the truth. And I think it's all about knowing, understanding, but most of all, sharing the information so the speculation and the questions that people have regarding the physical health and also the health of the environment can be answered, and a decision can be made based upon all those facts. Our conference, we had called for a legislative hearing which would be open to the public, but we were denied by our Republican colleagues on the other side of the aisle, who we believe don't want to bring the information to you, bring the information to the public who has to make the decision. We can talk about jobs, we can talk about economic development, but I always say, to what expense are we going to harm people and our environment? So we must not allow hyper-partisan rhetoric to guide our actions, and we must confront one of the greatest environmental and financial decisions faced by New York State in generations. And the only way we can face that is by making sure we have all the information necessary. We don't want to wait until something happens afterwards and say, if we could have, would have, and should have. We need to do it now before we're in that position where we have to ask those questions. So I want to thank all my colleagues for their leadership, and I want to thank you for your commitment to ensuring that the health and safety and the environment should always come first when dealing with economic issues. We can have both as long as we have the information necessary to prevent any disaster that may occur. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Senator Sampson, and once again for your leadership on this issue. And now I'd like to call on my colleagues that are here, Senator Joe Adamo.
Thank you, Senator Avella, and I want to thank you and, of course, our minority leader, Senator John Sampson, and staff for their efforts here today on this most critical environmental issue. And to all of you who have traveled many miles and for your time here today and your participation, and we look forward to credible and accurate information regarding this most important environmental issue. I, again, am an opponent of hydrofracking, and I thank you very much for working with us on this issue. And frankly, you know, it's a question of we don't want, let's see here, ammonia persulfate magnesium nitrate or ethane diol potassium hydroxide or formaldehyde sodium hydroxide anywhere near our soil or water. Simple as that. But we have a long way to go to, I guess, distinguish between what's fact and fiction, and that's why we look forward to hearing from you and working with, you know, our colleagues in government and the governor's administration and DEC to do the right thing by our people throughout our state. So I look forward to working with you on this, again, most important, critical environmental issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Adamo, and now Senator Bill Perkins.
Thank you very much. For those of us from downstate, particularly the Harlems and the Upper West Side communities that I represent, obviously hydrofracking is a great concern. It may seem quite far away from the point at which the hydrofracking would take place for those of us who live so far away to be so concerned. But we understand that the distance does not mitigate the crime or the problem. In fact, in some respects, it will aggravate problems that we already have. For instance, we have young people who suffer from environmental issues already in our community with high rates of asthma and respiratory problems, which we believe hydrofracking will only aggravate by virtue of the fact that even though we are hundreds of miles away, the dust and the air pollution will continue to contribute to that. And so for us, in those communities that are already suffering environmental racism, this will contribute even more so to that effect. And dare say that the water that we are so dependent upon in our communities, we are concerned that this again will have an adverse impact on that as well. So I want to thank the chairman and our leader for pulling together this forum and providing us with an opportunity to hear from you and for you to hear from us and for us to begin to work even more closely together to make sure that hydrofracking is banned now and forever in New York State. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Perkins. Before we call the first panel, let me just give you some ground rules on procedure. Each speaker will be entitled to 3 minutes. We have on our list 55 speakers, and obviously some people have just signed up this morning. And we want to make sure that everybody's heard. So this forum will continue to 3 o'clock, because at 3 o'clock, Senate session begins, so we have to go, obviously, into session. But we hope to hear from everybody. I would ask that you keep to your 3-minute timetable. I will not cut somebody off in mid-sentence, obviously, but I ask that you be considerate of the other people that are here to testify. I think we can look forward to some very interesting testimony that can be used to not only enlighten the legislature about these issues, but enlighten the public as well, and taking that information, forward to DEC and the governor. What I'm going to do is have my legislative counsel, Rebecca Sheehan, who some of you have gotten to know quite well in arranging this forum. You almost got as much applause as I did, I'm going to ask her to call the panels. Ms. Sheehan.
Good morning, everyone. Professor Robert Oswald, Dr. Michelle Bamberger, Professor Elmer Ellis Ewing, and Wes Gillingham. It's the first panel.
And while they're seated, why don't you mention who the second panel is, so they can get ready.
Okay. And after that panel goes, we'll be calling, so just to be clear, after this panel is finished, the next panel will include Louise Maher Johnson, Dr. Jeanette Barth, Elizabeth Ratto,
Shall we start right to left? And while they're getting seated, we've been joined by State Senator Liz Krueger. Do you want to say something? Liz, do you want to say something?
Thank you. I guess you know my position on the issue, so glad to be here.
Oh, that was it? Okay. As you speak, please introduce yourself and the organization, obviously. You can sit. Okay.
Hello, my name is Wes Gillingham. I'm the program director for Catskill Mountain Keeper. I'd like to thank the panel for asking me to come testify today, and all the other distinguished colleagues that are going to speak to the problems with gas drilling in the state of New York. There are experts in the field who are going to testify to the specifics, and especially the specifics to the problems with health impacts to New York. The medical community across New York has become increasingly concerned about the health impacts of hydraulic fracturing. Throughout the country, health impacts ranging from the loss of smell, memory problems, headaches, to a number of serious respiratory illnesses and cancers have been associated with this process. In October, over 250 physicians and medical professionals joined together in asking for a health impact assessment. Throughout the last 4 years, since Catskill Mountain Keeper and groups across the state of New York have been looking at this issue, we have continually witnessed the process where information comes out about the impacts to drilling, whether it's the fact that air pollution in Texas and multitude of hydraulic problems, geologic issues that haven't been addressed, and we've continually seen Albany. Again, I applaud you for holding this hearing. However, we have continually seen Albany use excuses such as, well, let's wait until the DEC is done with the SGEIS. We've now gone through 2 SGEISs that are incredibly flawed and defunct. This isn't a baseball game. It's not 2 strikes, you're out, or 3 strikes, you're out. This is a serious problem that, as already mentioned, is the biggest environmental problem that New York State has faced in over a century. We need to cut through the politics and take the science that you will hear today from many colleagues who will point to specific problems that have been denied by industry over and over again. When Catskill Mountain Keeper first did a public forum 4 years ago, I called somebody in Wyoming and started talking to them about coming here to explain some of the problems with gas drilling. And one of the first things they told me was, if you're talking to landmen or if you're talking to folks in the industry and their lips are moving, they're lying. That's what I have experienced over the last 4 years. It's down a mile beneath protective rock. There's many hydrogeologic studies that show that's not true. That's the whole basis of this proposal, that we can pump 8 million gallons of toxic poison into the ground and it's going to stay there and we're all safe. Let alone the surface contamination that happens from faulty hoses, from bad casing. There are so many flaws in this proposal that it's outrageous that we're even sitting here today still discussing this. We've had 4 years of an educational process that could tell anybody with half a brain, nothing personal, Andrew Cuomo, that this should not go forward until we really understood that it was safe, and that is not what we're finding out. There is no until. This is not a safe process, and it should not go forward. I could go on and on for a long time, but there's a lot of other people that are going to talk to the specifics of the science, like the person right next to me here. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Robert Oswald. I'm a professor of molecular medicine at Cornell University College of Veterinary Medicine. I thank the panel for allowing me to testify today. The shale gas controversy that has dominated our news for the last few years and has really brought more people to public meetings, such as town board meetings, than any other issue in recent years. I know it brought me to my first town board meeting. We require energy to live in this world, but what degree of risk and environmental degradation are acceptable? Who should be asked to sacrifice and who should profit? We don't really pretend to know the answer to these questions, but like Governor Cuomo, we believe that science should prevail. Where we differ from Governor Cuomo is that we realize that the science that we need to understand this process has not been done and will not be done, to use his phrase, in months rather than years. So what are the most important questions? We know that engineers and geologists can extract these hydrocarbons. That's not the question. The remaining questions are not in the realm of engineers and geologists. They're questions of public health. The DEC has been curiously silent on questions of public health with respect to hydraulic fracturing, other than just to dismiss it as something that other states with poor regulations have to deal with. But nothing can be further from the truth. We need to assess the public health impacts, and we need to do it now before any type of permitting for high-volume horizontal drilling could be permitted in New York State. Michelle Bamberger, who's to my right here, and I have been documenting the health effects of gas drilling in production and companion animals as well as humans. It's difficult to do controlled experiments in this area. It's hard to know cause and effect. But we've come close in a number of cases where we have cow herds dispersed into 2 pastures. One herd, or half the herd, has been exposed to wastewater or contaminated well water, and the other is unexposed. In the 3 cases that we've documented that this has happened, the cows exposed to the wastewater or contaminated well water have either died or experienced reproductive problems. The control herd, or the one not exposed, have been fine. They were originally the same herd. They were just separated for whatever reason that the farmer thought of at the time. Perhaps more importantly, the health effects that we see are not limited to animals. They're also seen in their owners, in people. In fact, our evidence suggests that an important reason for studying animals is that the health effects of toxic chemicals are actually first often seen in exposed animals, that animals are really good sentinels of human health. But the major finding really is that with the current state of affairs, we can't definitively assess the dangers of hydraulic fracturing. We desperately need a comprehensive health impact study such as that required by Senate Bill S. 6772. We need to do adequate pre-drilling testing, both air and water, and I have to say the S-GUICE is terribly inadequate. The pre-drilling testing that they mandate is almost laughable. We need to know the chemicals that are used in the drilling process in order to do that testing. We don't have that information, and Frac Focus does not really give it to us. So we need to pass Senate Bills S-3483 and S-2697A. And I just want to put in one other plug. I think we need to affirm home rule. We need to make sure that local communities have the right to zone out a drilling rig 150 feet from their churches, schools, and homes. Again, that's Senate Bill S-2697A and S-3472. All other forms of energy production, solar and wind, are controlled by zoning. This should also apply to gas drilling. But let's make sure, let's not lose sight of the fact that the most important health issue here is one that's almost completely ignored by the DEC and its S-GUICE, and that's public health. Without rigorous scientific studies, the gas drilling boom sweeping the world will remain an uncontrolled health experiment on an enormous scale, and we will be the laboratory mice. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. My name is Dr. Michelle Bamberger. I'm a veterinarian in private practice in New York. For the past 2 years, Robert Oswald and I have been studying the health of people and animals living nearby gas drilling operations. The best summary of our work is that we have arrived at more questions than answers, have raised more red flags than green lights. Some questions we ask: what are all of the chemicals used during drilling, hydraulic fracturing, processing, and production? At what specific concentration is each chemical used? What are all of the naturally occurring chemicals, radioactive materials, bacteria, and other life forms that come up from the shale with the wastewater? What are all of the chemicals being flared, vented, or otherwise released during the processes of drilling, hydraulic fracturing, processing, production, and transport? What are the short and long-term health effects of each chemical on people, domestic animals, and wildlife? At which concentrations might each chemical cause a response in each animal species, including humans? For example, chemicals affecting the endocrine system make up nearly 40% of all known chemicals used in gas operations and may affect a wide variety of organ systems in the body at very low non-pharmacological concentrations. How do we test for each of the chemicals in each animal species, including humans? Might these chemicals accumulate in plants and in animals? Farmers ask us if these chemicals can get into their crops and their livestock. The public asks us if these chemicals will end up in their vegetables, their milk, their eggs, their fish, their meat, their children, and themselves. Hunters and fishermen ask if the wildlife will be safe to eat. Until we know the answers to all of these questions, we cannot begin to guess the answer to the question, is fracking safe? Until we know the answers to all of these questions, the safety of our food supply is at risk, and the public health is at risk over both the short and the long term. I strongly support the New York State Senate Health Impact Assessment Bill, 6772 Avella. And until we know the answers to all of these questions, horizontal drilling with high-volume hydraulic fracturing for extraction of gas should be prohibited in New York State. I strongly support New York State Senate Bill S4200A Avella. Thank you.
Why don't we do the panel then?
I thank Senator Avella and the Senate Democratic Conference for holding this forum and for the opportunity to participate in it. I am an emeritus professor from the Cornell College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, but I'm speaking for myself only. A couple of years ago, a high-ranking member of the DEC confided to a few of us that we were right to be concerned about fracking. Drinking water might become contaminated. One big problem, she said, was how to dispose of the fracking waste. And the other problem was human error, things like chemical spillage and improper cement jobs. She assured us, however, that there was zero chance that the chemicals from the fracking zone would ever make their way up through the layers of rock to contaminate our aquifers. I agree that disposal of hazardous waste from fracking is a major concern, and so is human error throughout the operation, and that either concern, I think, is reason enough to ban the use of hazardous chemicals in fracking. Recent research, however, makes me wonder whether an even greater danger is chemical migration from the fracking zone up through the aquifers, the very migration which our DEC friend said could never happen. I won't attempt to recite all the evidence, but I will include some of it in my written testimony. Suffice it to say that taken together, a group of recent papers presents a disturbing picture. Through the use of natural radioisotopes to fingerprint methane, it's been shown that methane contaminating well water near fracking sites originated not from the organic matter around, which drilling companies want us to believe, but deep down in the earth where the gas is. Other work found that the closer a water well was to a fracking site, the higher the methane level tended to be in the well water there. And most notably, ongoing EPA research in Wyoming is finding many fracking chemicals in the well water near gas wells. Then there's a recent peer-reviewed paper, it's out just 2 weeks ago, where a mathematical approach is taken based on interpretive modeling. The author's Tom Myers. He calculates that ordinary transport of chemicals from deep shale all the way up to the aquifers would take tens of thousands of years. More or less agrees with what our friend from the DEC said. But he also calculates that the explosively high pressures used in hydrofracking would reduce the transport time to centuries or decades, and in some circumstances, to less than 10 years. By the way, the first fracking of a horizontal gas well was done just 10 years ago. According to Myers' calculations, the toxins you just heard about could begin to arrive in their journey from the fracking zone to the aquifers anytime within the next decade or two. Shall we take the chance he's wrong? Shall we pump billions of gallons of toxic water under New York soil to find out? I don't think so. Thank you.
You know, thank you for your testimony. I mean, this is exactly, I think, what we need to hear and what New Yorkers need to hear about the process from your expert testimony. I know some of my colleagues have some questions. First of all, I'd like to introduce State Senator Gustavo Rivera. And also we have my colleagues Dan Squadron. And Senator Stewart Cousins. I think Senator Kruger has a question, and then, okay.
I think just for the last two speakers, so you talked about the impact on the agriculture sector on as a veterinarian, as a scientist. You didn't mention agricultural animals, and it's been a major concern of mine that we don't know what the impact will be on agricultural animals, and therefore, of course, many of us eat agricultural animals, which will translate to the human food supply. And I've been a bit appalled that the Farm Bureau is actually supporting hydrofracking, and I was just wondering whether you had any response on that issue.
Actually, I am continuing, we're continuing in this research, it's ongoing. And just yesterday, I spoke with a very large conventional dairy farmer in Susquehanna County who just sold her last cow 2 weeks ago. She is also a member of the Farm Bureau there in Pennsylvania, as well as being a member of the Soil and Water Conservation District. So she has this unique outlook. And she told me that the drilling there in Pennsylvania has really been a mixed blessing. She said, you know, you just can't make a living at farming. We just can't make a living at farming anymore. So when these drillers come by and offer all of this money, and it can be the only way to hold on to your land, farmers grab at that. Okay, but she said it's really a mixed blessing, because then what happens is you can hold on to your land, but you lose your farm. Farms are going out of business. She had to sell her cows. They've had cows there since 1984. She said it's ripping them up that they had to go out of business. She told me all about the problems they had. Their water went bad. It actually turned black after drilling and fracking. They could not afford to bring in water for their cows. They switched to bottled water, and they started feeling better. They were starting to feel very sick with intestinal problems. They switched, they got better. That's after doing tests, a lot of tests with their doctor that all came back negative. Okay, but their cows had to continue to drink that water. So over time, they were seeing reproductive problems. Their cows weren't cycling, they weren't getting bred. They saw some neurological things. Cows were going down, they weren't able to stand up. There was not the typical reason that a cow goes down. It wasn't a metabolic thing. They also saw neurologic problems in their goats and their dogs. So this was not something that was just occurring in one species too. They saw a drastic drop in milk production, which really blew her away. She was watching it happening. She saw a drastic drop. And then she said, you know what, milk is mostly water. My cows don't want to drink this water. She watches them lap and throw their heads up. They don't want to drink this water. And so how could they produce milk? They weren't producing milk. It dropped by half. And she was watching them start to waste away. This is something I've heard repeatedly from other farmers. Their cows start to lose weight. They start to waste. They can't hold on to their weight. And she said, you know, I couldn't bear to watch this happen to my cows anymore. I've been selling them off. They'll go to other farms, hopefully, where drilling is not occurring, and they'll start drinking again, and they'll be healthy. So after hearing that, putting that together with our study, we have a number of farmers that have gone out of business, and I've heard from people in the area in Pennsylvania of farmers going out. This is why they're going out. So what's happening here? The farmers are grabbing at the money, they desperately need it, and then on the other hand, they're losing their farms, they're losing their water. She said, it's just not worth the price. We're poisoned, we're being poisoned ourselves, we're poisoning our animals.
I just want to add a little story to that ties in the last testimony and the statement that Michelle just made. A couple of years ago, when Catskill Mountain Keeper, NRDC, Earth Justice, and the Riverkeeper hired a petroleum engineer from Alaska, and we hired a hydrogeologist to look at the SGEIS. At one of the conference calls, the two of them got into a little discussion because the hydrogeologist was saying, well, if the fracture from the hydraulic fracturing operation reaches the sandstone above the Marcellus, it will clearly make its way into the aquifer. And they were going back and forth. This was a little argument, and at the heated point of the argument, the petroleum engineer said, a good fracker doesn't frack out of zone. I would put out the scientific theory that a good fracker is very rare.
Senator Perkins.
See, here we go. Thank you very much for your testimony. I have two quick questions. One is related to the governor, but I'll ask you that one second. Those of us who live in my community, my district downstate, can you share very graphically and explicitly why this should be a concern of ours?
I could try to do that. One of the things that I find very ironic is that as far as our the food crops we grow and the animal crops that we make, that we grow for the food that your people will eat, those are really restricted. It's really restricted as to what chemicals we can use in the production of those foods. We're trying to protect people, the consumer, from getting anything that would be obviously poisonous or bad for people. So there's a lot of law about that. But the water that we would be feeding the animals or putting on the crops that might have been exposed to these chemicals through exposure from the hydrofracking, nothing seems to be worried about. Nobody seems to be worried about that. It seems to be okay to have the chemicals in the water, but not in the food, not in the fertilizer we put on or pesticides we put on. You have to be careful there, but not in the water. That seems very strange to me.
Could I add one thing to that? Well, actually, two things. One is, we know of some cases where cows have been exposed and quarantined, so they weren't allowed to be sent to market. Then we looked into how long they would have to be kept before they could be sent to market. And actually, there's no data on that. The only agency that does that said that they really just have to make up the numbers in that case. There's no scientific basis. They just say, okay, maybe 6 months, then you can send them off to slaughter. Second point is, in a number of cases, animals that have died from exposure, they of course can't be sent to market, but they can be sent to rendering plants and fed to chickens and to fish. So even though you're not getting the meat directly, you can get it indirectly in the feed.
So Governor Cuomo seems to be very committed to hydrofracking. And has he had the benefit of this science and information that you're sharing, and why would he be so hell-bent on it?
Well, I would just like to say, is he here today? Where is he? He has not responded. I've written personal letters to him. I've emailed. I've called. My husband has too. I'm sure many other people have. We get a letter back saying, thank you for contacting our office. I'd like you to direct you to my website for more information about my campaign and what I do. What kind of response is that? This is a really important public health issue. I sent the paper, opening myself for conversation. We get nothing back. So I don't know the answer to that question.
Last spring, there was a letter that was sent by medical professionals, and it was asking the governor and the Department of Health there was a series of asks in this letter. Some of them came from recommendations from the EPA that the Department of Health should be co-lead agent in the SGIS process. That didn't happen. The other thing that was asked for in that letter was a health impact assessment. There was a follow-up meeting that took place with the Department of Health, which is under the direction of Andrew Cuomo, and there was no push by his office to get the Department of Health to do a health impact assessment or even look at it. We were basically ignored by the Department of Health. The Department of Health did a presentation for the governor's panel on drilling, and at that meeting, they were asked why they didn't do an analysis, not even a health impact assessment, which is a whole process, but an analysis of health impacts, and the response was, no one told us to. There's only one person that tells them what to do. So that's the letter that I mentioned in my testimony that came out in October by another whole series of health associations and doctors, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, the New York State Nurses Association, and the Medical Society in New York, all are asking for a health impact assessment. And that, again, was ignored. It got put into the budget, as you know, on the Assembly side, and you all attempted to get it into the budget on the Senate side, and you know more about what happened with that than I do.
And I'll certainly talk about that after my colleagues have a chance to ask their questions. Senator?
I just want to thank you so much, and if there's any such communications that you can share, I'd appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Senator Adaba.
I want to thank this panel for their time and testimony today. And just a quick question, and maybe future panels can address this question as well. Are there any known safer alternatives to fracking?
We have one on the roof of our home. It's solar panels. They work very well.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank Senator Avella and my colleagues for organizing this, and thank the panel. And I hope that members of the industry themselves responded positively to your invitation. And I know I was a little late. Maybe I've already missed them. Maybe they're coming later. But certainly, we'd also like to. Oh, they're not going to be here. That's disappointing that they declined your invitation, Senator Avella. So let me ask you. We hear a lot about the research, and it was mentioned in the testimony here. And on one side, you hear, look, there's been an enormous amount of research on this. We know it's safe, right? We know it's safe. We know it works. And on the other hand, it seems like there's new information coming out all the time. But some of that was referenced now. I know that information on the on tremors and the seismic activity seems to be, moving, almost week to week, certainly month to month at this point. So just so that I can really understand where we are in terms of research into the health effects, environmental effects, and I guess now seismic effects of fracking. In your view, and sort of ask any or all the members of the panel, is it clearly safe in those three ways? Is it clearly unsafe? Or is it clearly unsafe and there's, in fact, new information coming in all the time about it? Just because it seems to me that this is one of those, it should be a question of fact, but there's a lot of different facts being asserted out there. So just to be very clear, how much do we know about the risks and how safe this is today? How much is still coming in? Just so that we can all be in the same starting place.
Well, I can say for sure that there's not a lot of research out there. We surveyed the literature for the last 50 years on the subject. There were some old studies back in the 60s. There were a few things done over the years, but it's not really until the last few years that there have been health impact studies done, say the last 2 or 3 years. And there haven't been that many of them. Right now, all we can say is that there are red flags. We know that there are many, many things that seem to be problematic. We need to know more. We need to do a health impacts study. We need to actually have better disclosure of the chemicals that are used so that we can test them before drilling and after drilling. And let me just say one more point that I think is extremely important, and that is when people have problems, they will confront companies, and generally what happens is they might take them to court and they might get a settlement. But usually the settlement is accompanied by a non-disclosure agreement. And when they sign a non-disclosure agreement, the information about that case is effectively sealed, removed from the public domain. So the cases cannot be studied. So until we get rid of the possibility of using non-disclosure agreements in cases of public health, I'm not talking about getting rid of non-disclosure agreements altogether, but in cases where public health is affected, we are going to inhibit scientific inquiry.
I would just emphasize that last piece. There are hundreds and hundreds of non-disclosure agreements out there, and there's many known situations where someone clearly has documented contamination on their farm or in their backyard, and they've been forced to go into a non-disclosure situation because the value of their house has dropped to nothing, and they have health problems that they need to deal with and can't afford to deal with, so they have to do that. That's a serious problem that's playing out all across the country.
And
I would say that says it is not safe.
I would point out that you hear over and over, well, 60 years of fracking and we've never had a problem. Well, one of the reasons is the non-disclosure agreements, but there are many other reasons too. One thing is that it's not 60 years old. The technique of using horizontal fracking, which is what we're talking about here in the shales, that's 10 years old at the most. I mean, it was 2002 when the first fracking job on a horizontal well was done. So there haven't been that many years for problems to come up. So when you hear that 60 years baloney, say, not 60 years, 10 years, and then there've been lots of problems. They just get squashed by the non-disclosure agreements.
And let me just ask this, if we take a little more time to really understand this relatively new procedure that has all these red flags, as was mentioned, I think that's a useful phrase here. Take some time to study those red flags. Is the natural gas going to disappear in the next couple of decades?
What I would say from what we've seen so far, I doubt whether, I agree with what was said earlier. I don't see how it can ever be safe. That's just one man's opinion. But I don't see how it can overcome the problems we know about now.
But certainly under any circumstance, there's no rush. The natural resource will be there for a long time, and the research is still coming in under any
Absolutely.
circumstance. Thank you very much.
We have about 1 billion years to extract the gas from the shale.
Thank you. That's the number I was looking for, 1 billion. I always like getting 1 billion as an answer to almost any question. Thank you very much.
Just to finish that point, one of the things here that is another serious problem, and that's one of the issues with this whole proposal to hydrofrack in New York. Even if the technology, if there was no such thing as casing failure, if there was no such thing as a truck, not making it around the turn that causes these contamination problems that have been documented across the country, even if there weren't hundreds of natural faults in New York State, we are still dealing with a legacy problem in the state of improperly plugged wells from the past. And the question about how communities that aren't over the shale are exposed to it came up, and the discussion of the health impact to animals. Near my home in the Catskills, a couple miles away, there's one of the few Marcellus wells that was drilled in New York State. It's 8,000 feet down, and I talked to a driller who is a water well driller now in the area, and he worked for Gulf when he was younger. And he worked for Gulf drilling those wells. And how they plugged that well was pulled 5,000 feet of casing out of the ground and dropped dynamite down the hole. That is a straw that's waiting to bring contaminants to our aquifer in that region. And there's hundreds of those and thousands of those. There's 18,000 recognized ones, but there's many more across the state. That's a problem that needs to be fixed no matter what kind of drilling we're talking about, not just horizontal drilling and hydrofracking, but vertical wells, any kind of drilling. That problem needs to be dealt with, and it has not been dealt with.
And read Ron Bishop's testimony about that. It deals with it very effectively.
Like I said, panel, I do want to thank all of you for your testimony. And just a quick comment. We tried to introduce the hostile amendment to get the health impact assessment in the budget. The Senate majority, the Republican majority, voted us down. This is a major priority for us, and we consider that the minimum that should be done at this point. So thank you.
Okay, I'll be calling the next panel. Louise Johnson, David Grodsky, Dr. Jeanette Barth, and Elizabeth Ratto. Thank you. And after this panel is complete, we'll be calling Josh Fox, Dr. Larissa Dirska, and Professor Margaret Rafferty. And I apologize for any mispronunciations.
Hi, good morning, legislators. Louise Johnson, Sky Hill Farm, organic eggs. I want to just comment.
Hold it a little closer to you.
I want to just comment that the Northeast Organic Farming Association of New York has voted to ban fracking and have pages and pages of information about reasons why. And another, just throwback to the last panel, I got solar panels on my farm when a NYSERDA was paying half of the money. Farmers now have to put up the full amount and then get half back, or whatever it is that's coming back. And so I've heard from farmers that they can't afford to get solar panels. They can't afford to put up $60,000, even if they get 30 or 20,000 back in the future. So it's not so much about earthquakes, it's the faults and fractures. Dr. Palmer, hydrologist, geochemist, and former head of water resources at SUNY Oneonta, is concerned about pressurized fracking fluids being transported rapidly and unpredictably through this underground grid of interstate highways, even under mountaintop divides and into adjacent valleys where fracking might be banned. When the fluids, then the fluids will exit the express lane and move slowly with normal groundwater flow toward the valley aquifers that supply more than 75% of the water for reservoirs, lakes, and rivers. So, fracking outside the New York City watershed could fast-track contaminants beneath the topographical divide, protecting the watershed, and they could then seep up into any of the 6 New York City reservoirs in the valleys at the edges of the watershed. The New York City DEP is also concerned and has called for a 7-mile setback outside the boundaries, but Dr. Palmer says the concept of offset from water supplies is entirely inappropriate for this kind of contaminant transport. Using the percentage of benzene in one fracked well and an average amount of frack fluid left in the earth after fracking, Palmer roughly calculates that 1 square mile, 600 feet deep, of underground rock formation can be initially saturated with an amount of benzene that is more than 5,000 times the EPA standard. This scenario considers just a single contaminant in a single well. Indeed, the DEC is asking for 8 wells on a single well pad. This saturation will then move through fractures quickly or fissures slowly, and then down gradient toward valley aquifers in valleys where most people, farms, and industries are located. The DEP has mapped faults and fractures in and around the watershed, but most fractures still remain unidentified. Most are almost impossible to detect, even with geophysical methods. And the DEC doesn't plan to require detection. So are the fractures and the contaminants that they will bring to our drinking water a distant tomorrow's problem? Like the senator said, 100 years, 10,000 years. Again, this new hydrological study just accepted for publication by Tom Myers projects a time frame of perhaps 10 years or less. Dr. Palmer says there is a real potential for contamination in surrounding river valleys within our own lifetimes. One of our largest river valleys is the Capital District, where the huge valley aquifer beneath the Mohawk River slowly flows down gradient into the aquifer below the Hudson River. So Albany will get to play water tap roulette along with many other valley towns. Farm and wild animals, pets and crops and industry can also play this water roulette game of mostly low-level chronic exposure to a suite of toxic and carcinogenic hydrofracking chemicals far into the future. Thank you.
First of all, again, I'd like to thank the senators for this. We need you to do this fight. Considering the exemptions from the Clean Air, Clean Water, and Environmental Act.
Introduce yourself again, I'm sorry.
David Grotsky from Otsego County. Considering the exemptions from Clean Air, Water, and Environmental Acts, and I've got 7 of them listed that I handed in. I'm sure you have these. The Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Water Act, the Toxic Release Energy of the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and the Clean Air Act. They're known as the Halliburton loopholes. And considering the exemptions from them, without which this industry couldn't function, it seems reckless and bizarre that we're even having this conversation. Why is this even being considered if an industry that couldn't work without these exemptions? One of the senators asked the panelists to comment on, and it's clearly safe. There's an EPA study in progress as we speak, yet New York State can't wait until it is complete and thoroughly reviewed before we even start on an SGICE. And as has been mentioned, the previous attempts at an SGICE have been beyond pathetic. It's not just about water, although that's our main concern. 11 years ago, my wife and I were on a long trip. We drove through Wyoming, and the air was it was crystal clear to the horizon. Now, EPA reports the air quality is often worse than Los Angeles. So it's not just that you need a water buffalo. You're going to have to walk around with air tanks if you have asthma or any pulmonary condition. As a member of the Morris Emergency Squad, I'm proud to serve there. The Department of Health, New York State Department of Health, found that flowback water can be up to about, I believe it's 270 times as radioactive as EPA discharge. Not to mention that the EPA gave this flowback water, brine it's called, a beneficial use determination, and it's started to have been spread on roads for dust control and de-icing. That's bizarre. What we also need to know, and this is what a former chief of Otsego County Emergency Services Act, are we going to get decontamination equipment? Is every first responder going to get a hazmat suit, Geiger counter, and dosimeter, and the training to use it? I have to tell you, right now, many of us spend many hours waiting for adequate response to this. In fact, Bradford County, Pennsylvania, and Otsego County both have populations of just over 60,000, or about 1,000 square miles. It's not that far from here. So the terrain and climate are the same. Otsego County now averages 400 911 calls a month, and we're hard put to answer those. Bradford County, since the advent of drilling, is up to 2,500. 6 times for this equivalent population and area. It seems, again, about the health impact study, it seems amazing that we eliminated this small amount. And by the way, any health impact study should also review the history, the work, medical, and accident history of workers in the industry. The industry promises all these jobs. Let's see just how safe those jobs are. So that should be included. And I guess my extreme statement, and I really appreciate this, you senators fighting against this. If we knew then what we know now, with the process the way it is, it seems almost like New York State would have allowed Love Canal, even knowing. And this is what we are grateful for you fighting against.
Hello. I'm Jeanette Barth, PhD economist with the Papacton Institute. Thank you for inviting me to testify. I frequently write and lecture on the subject of the economic impact of shale gas drilling. I have provided copies of 9 of the documents that I have written. Our decision makers in both Albany and Washington are relying on misinformation regarding the economic impact of shale gas development. Independent researchers, not funded by the gas industry, reach vastly different conclusions from industry-funded studies. President Obama has been quoting a study done by IHS Global Insight, which was prepared for America's Natural Gas Alliance. This study exaggerates benefits and ignores significant economic costs. In fact, all of the studies funded by the gas industry has done the same, as has the DEC in its SGEIS. They use exaggerated reserve and production estimates, thereby overstating projections of jobs, income, and tax revenue. They ignore costs to communities, such as the costs associated with increased truck traffic, costs associated with increased demands on fire departments, police, hospitals, and social services. the loss of jobs in other industries that are not compatible with an increased industrial landscape or with the risk of water and air contamination. They also ignore job losses due to crowding out and the cost of long-term busts, which typically follow extractive industries. An ignored opportunity cost to upstate communities is the loss of future developments as mazes of gathering and transmission lines are built, ruling out future building and economic development after the gas industry leaves the area in a few years. Here are just a few of the conclusions from other independent researchers, and I quote, "The areas of the United States having the highest levels of long-term poverty tend to be in the very places that were once the site of thriving extractive industries." And there is clear evidence that resource-dependent counties in the United States exhibit more anemic economic growth. And due to questionable assumptions in reports sponsored by the gas industry, the economic impacts estimated in these reports are very likely overstated. In addition to overstated economic projections, shale gas supporters tout both energy independence and low gas prices. The reality is that foreign corporations are buying many of our shale gas assets, and the gas industry is planning to export our domestic supply in order to obtain higher prices. This is likely to raise domestic prices. In addition, major shale gas companies are curtailing production due to the low prices, calling into question the notions that there is either a need for this risky drilling or that there is any urgency to the matter. The oil and gas industry spends huge amounts of money on lobbying, political contributions, public relations, advertising, and even economic impact studies in order to spread falsehoods and hide the truth. Here is the truth. Extractive industries create boom and bust cycles, and communities in upstate New York are likely to be worse off economically in the long run if we allow shale gas development. Encouraging oil and gas development is not an effective strategy for creating jobs in New York. The domestic price of natural gas is unlikely to remain low in the long run. The only parties likely to benefit in the long run from shale gas development in the Marcellus Shale are the gas companies and a very few lucky landowners, while serious long-term costs will be borne by the public and local communities. Thank you.
Before you give your testimony, I just want to acknowledge that we've also been joined by Senator Jose Peralta.
My name is Elizabeth Radow. How do you do? Thank you, Senator Avella and colleagues, for holding today's hearing and for inviting me to testify. I'm a lifelong New Yorker, a lawyer, and a mom. I chair the Hydraulic Fracturing Committee for the League of Women Voters of New York State. My published research on gas leases, risk allocation, and mortgages is what brings me here today. My law practice has included land acquisition, finance, and construction. All New Yorkers need a place to call home and safe food to eat. New York State depends upon a reliable real property tax base. These basics are at risk with unconventional gas drilling. Across America, property ownership is being revolutionized by the proliferation of multi-step, heavy industrial drilling operations on the land surface of private homes and farms. Home represents a family's most valuable asset. From a property value standpoint, think of a home as a bundle of rights: the right to construct, get a mortgage loan, lease and sell the property, the right to clean running water, electricity, a roof over one's head, and most important, a safe place to raise children, crops, or cattle, or all of the above. Americans pay for these rights when we purchase our homes and expect these rights to continue until we sell. We want the property value to increase. So does the state. Our tax base depends upon it. Up to now, home has represented the one place people can control. Gas leases grab homeowner control. They give the gas company the free right to sell the lease or take in investors without homeowner consent. This means the homeowner has no control over who comes onto their private property to drill or the quality of the work they perform. Because of trends in gas lease financing, now homeowners have to accept the possibility that foreign interests will control the gas lease on their property. Consider that while the mortgage lender expects the home to retain its value for the 30-year life of a loan, a gas lease investor on that very same property cares more about extracting the most gas at the least expense. As we saw with the BP oil spill, cutting corners for the bottom line contributed to that catastrophe. Here we are talking about highly leveraged leases on people's property. What impact will that have on your constituents, their children, and New York's farm produce? Standard gas leases grab homeowner control of property use by giving the gas company the right to establish surface operations, create perpetual unfunded road and utility easements, and the right to store gas underground from any source. Gas leases introduce hazardous activity and hazardous substances, practices which are expressly prohibited by standard mortgages. The leases do not require the gas company to fund or perform the maintenance, repair, and ultimate restoration of the easements and other surface uses, so that expense potentially stays with the property owner. The gas company 10-Ks filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission characterize the drilling life cycle as inherently risky activity and include in the list of hazards blowouts, explosions, pipe failures, and uncontrollable flows of natural gas or well fluids. Well water contamination can occur at one or more points in the drilling process, including from leaks, spills, and cracked casings. The states of Pennsylvania and Wyoming provide living examples. I have had calls from people living in upstate New York who have experienced problems with vertical wells. Agriculture represents one of New York's most important economies. Counties covering the Marcellus Shale region include numerous farms. Safe food requires uncontaminated water, air, and soil. A property without potable water will lose substantial value and may not sell or may cause a farm to fail, causing ripple effects on the state's tax base. Standard gas leases fail to mention insurance. Homeowners remain potentially liable for the activity that occurs on their property if it is not effectively delegated. Homeowner insurance excludes from coverage industrial activity and leaves homeowners vulnerable to losing their insurance coverage. A mortgaged home without homeowners insurance will result in loss of the mortgage. If a person cannot get a mortgage or keep a mortgage, the house will be difficult to sell. Already, mortgage lenders in New York are connecting the dots and denying loans. What will that do to the tax base? I urge all New York senators to embrace energy options that will preserve property value and New York's property tax base. Based upon the limited property owner protections in place now, current shale gas extraction methods, if performed on people's private property or farms, would pose a substantial risk. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Certainly, you brought new aspects to this issue. The real estate prices and the false impression that a lot of jobs are going to be created. Two questions I have, and then I'll ask my colleagues if they have questions. In terms of the jobs created, I think it was Congressman Turner, who's now running for the United States Senate, actually came out and said 70,000 jobs would be created by hydrofracking in the state. Does anybody want to comment on that? 70,000.
The 70,000 job number, I don't know exactly where that came from. I have reviewed, I think, every single study of job creation having to do with shale gas development, both out west, in Texas, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York. I don't actually know where that number came from. I know that I hear Obama stating the 600,000 jobs across the nation. We know, I have critiqued the study that came from. That's actually included in my package to you. But that particular study, and all of them, overstate reserves. So if you're overstating reserves and production, you're clearly, and you're putting those overstated assumptions into any kind of economic model, projections of employment that come out of that model are going to be overstated as well. Furthermore, the type of analysis that's typically used in these studies is something called input-output analysis. And that is an excellent tool in some cases. I've used it a number of times myself. But in this particular case, it's not appropriate as a standalone technique. Input-output analysis overstates the benefits, and it leaves out many, many significant costs, which is true of all of these studies in many ways. And one of the things that this type of analysis leaves out are any potential declines in other industries in the area. So we'll be losing employment in other industries. And it doesn't discuss the crowding out issue, as wage rates maybe are bid up in a short-term boom industry, whereby other existing businesses cannot afford to keep up with those wage rates, so they can't get workers and they go out of business as well. That's the crowding out phenomenon, which is rarely ever mentioned in this.
Good. Is it also safe to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of the jobs that are created are very temporary in nature?
Oh, absolutely. We know from Pennsylvania, there are a lot of anecdotes about looking at license plates from Oklahoma and Texas and all of these drilling areas. But we do know reports from Pennsylvania have stated that up to approximately 70% of the workers come from out of state. And if workers are coming from out of state, they're often coming on a transient basis, and while you might see hotel occupancy go up, and some people, I even saw a report once that in Pennsylvania they claimed it's been great for tourism because hotel occupancy is up, and that's how they were measuring tourism. They're not really good ways to measure tourism, and that is typically how one might measure tourism, but it's giving a false impression because it's these temporary workers that are staying in hotels, and those temporary workers are not full-time residents, so they're not paying local taxes, and they're not even spending much of their money that they make in the local economy. They're sending their money to their families in their home states to help the economies there. There was a paper that I wrote early on in early 2010 that explained even that that Texas may benefit more from shale gas drilling in New York than will New York, because many of the workers come from Texas and all of the headquarters are down in that area, as well as the ancillary industries. Thank you.
Good. Thank you for that answer. In reference, did you want to comment on that? No.
Just an additional thing, seeing reports from Pennsylvania that where there is a lot of drilling like endemic, homelessness is way up.
In terms of your testimony about property values, has there been any study done in some of the other states where hydrofracking has occurred on a comprehensive basis about how property values have dropped?
There has been no study to my knowledge. I've got anecdotal information. I can comment that the SGICE itself, with a very, I would say, thin report, shows that property values do go down where drilling is occurring. I'm going to leave with you Valuation Magazine, in which I was interviewed along with appraisers in Texas. And interestingly, it all comes down to the water, ultimately. And in Texas, where the shale is deeper, the geology is different, water is scarcer. The issue there is not water quality, it's water quantity. And the appraiser who was interviewed in that, or there actually were a couple who were interviewed in that case, said that actually property values have gone sky high in certain regions, where somebody purchased a home, it went up to $300,000, someone flipped it to $500,000, and he pointed out the fact that they are not at all concerned about the environment, that this is very much a grab it while you can kind of approach to life. And, you know, I will concede that people have different philosophies about how they want to handle something. Do we just grab the money now and take it and run? Or do we make decisions about the fact that we are parents and we have future generations and obligations to our children? In New York, I would add that we have different geology. I call it an embarrassment of riches. We are blessed with water here. It is close to the surface. And while the gas industry will often say there are no cases of water contamination from fracking per se. Indeed, the water contamination can happen at many points along the continuum of the process, and I think it's very important that we don't get caught in the semantics. And water quality is directly linked to resale value of homes. And we have seen this in Pennsylvania. I've spoken to brokers. In New York State, of course, we're not doing this drilling yet. So this is going to be, what is the potential? In New York State, people are having difficulty selling their homes. A woman from Maryland, New York, called me where there's vertical fracking, and the broker said to her, because she's got a bubbling brook and there have been health impacts, I'm sorry, but I think it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to sell your home. You know, we can get this anecdotal. I will add, though, that people, particularly in Pennsylvania until very recently, are extremely reluctant to speak. This is the catch-22 here. People are feeling uncomfortable about being too open about this because they live in neighborhoods, they're concerned about retaliation. It's the same mentality, frankly, as the non-disclosure. So I think we really have to be very careful and read between the lines.
Thank you.
May I add something?
Sure.
The potential impact on property values, as you know, has been a very contentious issue in this. It's another one of the major unanswered questions. But I have seen reports that the Central Real Estate Appraisal District in Wise County, Texas, which is really in the heart of the Barnett Shale, they have valued homes. They have dropped the value in homes by as much as 75% if a gas well sits on the property. That's a huge decline. And similar reports in Colorado have been on the order of 22 to 25% decline in value.
Some of my colleagues have some questions. First, I'll call on Senator Stewart Cousins.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Senator Avella, for convening this forum. I was just curious. I think Mr. Brodsky, is that your name?
Louise Johnson?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
The gentleman. In your testimony, you talked about the amount of 911 calls. I wasn't sure that I'd gotten what the actual statistics were. Could you just repeat those?
Yes, I checked with the head of emergency services in Otsego County, and he told me it averages about 400 a month. And what I've heard is in Bradford County, it's now up to 2,500.
In Bradford County, it's
Yes,
up to, from
Pennsylvania. Since drilling.
Since drilling.
Yes.
And has there been any study or anything in terms of what now is the major cause of these calls? Are there respiratory problems? Is there? If you don't know, that's fine. I think it would be interesting, though, for us to find out if indeed.
This was a brief conversation with one of the officials in Bradford County, and basically traffic accidents and again, whatever medical there are, but traffic and probably industrial accidents too, considering the nature of this process.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, this is the second, and this is really a comment, but this is the second hearing that I've been, one in Westchester County by another senator and here, and I have to say that I understand that this is a ban fracking crowd, but I am so shocked that the industry does not come to any of these hearings, because even if we understand what the overarching sentiment is going to be here in the hearing, to come and at least shed light, refute, anything would make everybody feel like there's nothing really to hide, and that the science has gotten to a point where, oh no, they said this, but now we're doing that. This never happened, so it is highly disturbing, but I do thank you again for convening this, Senator Avella, and thank all of you for testifying, but I'm very disappointed that the industry never comes.
Senator Kruger.
Thank you. We have so many wonderful people coming to testify today that I almost don't want to ask questions, but first I want to recognize Dr. Barth and thank you for all the work you have been doing for so many of us for so long. And all of your testimony, and I think particularly Elizabeth Radau's, shows how we didn't even ask the right questions in the SGIS. And that is constantly the theme that I think my colleagues will agree. We're asking DEC to evaluate a very high-risk new industry for the state of New York, except when we whoever drafted the scope of what they were supposed to look at and evaluate, we didn't even know half the questions that now we know should have been asked and answered in order to get to the right science. So, Elizabeth, your testimony about the impact on homeowners and mortgages and the responsibility for replacement of damaged land and liability. I think particularly that no one knew this, and particularly in light of the fact that you have all these non-disclosure agreements. Even if I was to ask you, so if we factored in the non-disclosure agreement, what really was the value of land and houses, I think you would have to tell me, well, I don't know, because obviously some of the worst-case scenarios are locked away in secret agreements, and so there's not truthful information out there for somebody attempting to study the question to get. So it's not so much a question as, you know, even how do we do the right research to get to the right answers before we allow any of this to go forward?
Well, I would say that I would hope there may be some attention paid to whether or not there are public policy reasons for not allowing non-disclosure agreements in certain circumstances. Because I am seeing on a sociological level, I think, a disintegration of this country, and I don't think being too dramatic when I say this. There was a reference made to the fact that people are homeless in Pennsylvania, and there is a cascading effect here. Let me just bear with me for a minute, because I know other people want to speak. But landlords are able to raise their rent because you've got people in the industry who can pay more for rent. So the people who were living with their families in those rentals, these are not people with gas leases, are now displaced. Once you take a family out of their home, it changes the entire dynamic of what is going to happen with the trajectory of the children in that family. You have drinking, you know the panoply of problems. And people are also afraid to speak. They can't even get the service people, social service people, to the people's homes wherever they're living, or they're living in cars, because the roads are torn up. I mean, it goes on and on and on. If we can get baseline studies to make sure that we know where we are at the beginning, so that we can say to the industry, we know where we're beginning right now, number one, and have them funded by the industry. However, they should be performed by third parties. And number two, I think there should be public policy that non-disclosure agreements are not okay. And number three, disclosure of the chemicals should not be trade secrets. Maybe some other type of protection, but that is not the appropriate type of protection. We cannot take care of ourselves if we don't know what we're putting in our bodies. And then we start to perhaps level the playing field. It may make the process expensive, but on the other side, we're not paying for it or subsidizing it. It seems to make it more fair. And then we get some of the answers to the questions that you're asking.
Thank you.
May I just add one thing? I want you to be aware, there is actually a recent study by a Dr. Bonita Kolb from Lycoming College that studied the homelessness impacts of gas drilling in Pennsylvania, and it confirms everything that Beth just said.
I want to thank this panel for their expert testimony. It's been very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. The next panel, Josh Fox, Dr. Larissa Dierska, Professor Margaret Rafferty, and Dr. Andrew Unger.
Before we take the testimony of this panel, I have to recognize, obviously, Josh Fox for his work on Gasland. I don't think, and I think it's realistic to say, I don't think we'd be at this stage of having these discussions without your help in that film. So we all appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Senator, and thank you for your leadership on this issue, and certainly also Senator Kruger. I really appreciate it.
Why don't you start us off?
Sure. Well, I am in the process of making Gasland 2, and since June of 2011, when it became apparent that the Cuomo administration would not continue the statewide moratorium, we began requesting both Governor Cuomo and Commissioner Martens for an on-camera interview to talk about the situation in New York State, because it is crucial to the situation in the rest of the world. Every 2 or 3 months, we've submitted formal requests for interviews, and every 2 or 3 months, we've heard nothing but silence. In March, we did submit
23 written questions and made it clear that if we didn't get an answer to these questions, we were going to take those answers as on the record. So I'm submitting, I won't be able to get to them all, but as my testimony, the questions that I believe are unanswered. And I want to state for the record that this is not a condemnation of the Cuomo administration. This is not a judgment of the Cuomo administration. I actually believe that sanity will prevail and they will do the right thing. And it is my hope that these questions are what I believe have not been addressed by the SGIS process. I've been watching the SGIS process unfold for many years, and it's my belief that the SGIS should be withdrawn. It is simply an out-of-date document, knowing what we know now. But the questions, and I won't be able to get to all of them, start with, number one, we've heard that the DEC is going to speed up its review of 60,000 comments received on the SGIS and come out with final regulations this spring. Is that true? Since the first round of 1,400 public comments took over a year to process, in what ways has the process changed to allow for the fast-track process to be done in an adequate and careful way? We don't know the answer to that question. Number two, and this is probably the most significant question, addressing the issue of well casing failure. As I've gone across the country and across the world on 4 continents, I've seen the same story unfold over and over and over again. This industry, wherever it goes, it contaminates groundwater. You have people who can light their water on fire, you have chemicals in water, you have a health crisis, you have air, all these things that we've heard about. But there is an answer, at least one answer. There's many ways in which hydraulic fracturing and gas drilling can contaminate groundwater. But the one that springs out as the most obvious is this well casing failure problem. When you have an industry that in their own documents admit that 6% of well casings fail immediately upon drilling, 6%, and that 50% fail over a 30-year period, you have the industry admitting to their own Achilles heel. This is not something that they can hide, and it is also something that they cannot fix. A gas well has 2 functions. One, the actual well, to extract gas. The other is to protect groundwater. It's part of the functionality of the well. There is a 1-inch layer of cement that is supposed to protect groundwater from migration of chemicals and gas. Cement cannot possibly last for the period of time that the gas well has to do that crucial function. That period of time begins with an F. It's forever. If you're putting a conduit into the ground between layers that produce oil and gas and hold toxic chemicals, that mechanical integrity in the cement has to last forever. And we're seeing 50% failure over a 30-year time period. 40% of the wells in the Gulf of Mexico are leaking. 6% immediate casing failure. This is not rocket science, right? It's drilling science. But it is not that complicated to look at the industry documents and say, well, how can you possibly imperil our groundwater situation when you know that these wells have an integrity, a fundamental integrity issue that cannot be solved, that the industry has been trying to solve for decades and cannot do it. In this case, you have a gas industry with an integrity problem. And if a government is going to endorse that plan, you have a government with an integrity problem. So how does the Cuomo administration answer the fundamental flaw of groundwater contaminations we've seen being proved over and over and over again? So those were the first 2 questions. And I will submit the rest of them for the record, as well as another copy of the film, Gasland, and in hopes that this administration will take this very scientific inquiry and journalistic inquiry seriously, and either attempt to answer this and deal with a fatally flawed industry, and withdraw the fatally flawed SGIS. That is my hope.
Thank you for the invitation, Senator Avella, Senator Kruger. Hi. My name is Larissa Durska. I'm a board-certified pediatrician
Hold the microphone a little closer to you.
And a public health advocate. And I have 3 issues for your consideration today, and that's the need for the health impact assessment now, radon, and social and environmental justice issues. When considering if a health impact assessment is an appropriate process to undertake, the first question to answer is whether this is important to human health and if the impacts will be significant. It's clear that the medical community of New York believes that it is imperative to study the health impacts using this HIA tool before proceeding with the SGIS process, and you've heard testimony already as to the organizations that have supported it. The ESCIs did not consider the broad determinants of human health which influence population health, and these include social justice factors such as equality, social inclusion, healthcare standards, existing disease burden, and vulnerable populations. Public services such as transportation, education, security, waste management, and environmental issues, and how those environmental issues would impact the vulnerable populations has not been discussed at all. Housing safety, adequacy, affordability, these are all determinants of human health and need to be considered whenever a large-scale land use decision is being made. Also, health behavior such as alcoholism, diet, drug abuse and recreation, and livelihood, you've heard about that as well, and community social support, which we haven't heard about too much yet, family structure and relationships that could possibly be disturbed. These all impact human health. Based on a preliminary review of available literature, it is evident from areas where gas drilling is already occurring that these determinants of health have been overlooked, and that's because health impact assessments are not routinely being done. We know that gas drilling frequently occurs in areas which have underserved and poor populations and near vulnerable group activities such as schools. Underlying health of the population is not considered when planning such industrial activities. And it's also known that unhealthy behaviors often accompany this industry, behaviors such as drug abuse and crime. Housing is known to become unaffordable once industry moves in. Homes with water contamination become unmarketable and families become displaced. Again, a stressor on human health. And, of course, there are the usual complaints, just annoyance sorts of issues. And that takes a toll on health as well. And these are just some of the examples that medical professionals have called attention to that have been overlooked in the SGIS. Lack of such discussion of these health impacts will result in more illness, increased costs to insurers and the state for health care. Social instability will also come about, and loss of community support. In other words, society can be impacted. And it will particularly impact those who are poor, already ill, and underserved and vulnerable. The proposed HIA process, which your bill has been presented, and thank you very much for that, would aim to include these determinants of human health and identify the stressors particular to New York State. And we have to address them in a transparent process with all stakeholders at the table, including industry residents, NGOs, people who have children in schools. Stakeholders should include the decision makers, and they haven't been at the table thus far. So you've already heard about the letter that the medical professionals have sent, and the lack of response from the governor and from the majority of the Senate. We do appreciate that the Assembly included it in their budget, and again, thank you for your bill. Without the full assessment and mitigation of the impacts of the risks, the health of New Yorkers will suffer, and we call for you to continue your advocacy on the health impact assessment. Among the potential stressors, and I'm just going to mention the two of them, is radiation and social injustice. We know that Marcellus is more radioactive than other shale plays. We also know that there's no inclusion in the SGIS of radioactivity at wellheads, pipelines, or at the end point, which is people's homes. And I have a lot more information in your packet, and I won't spend too much time on it at this point, but just to underscore that it will be a problem. It is a problem already. Other countries of the world have addressed oil and gas. There are regulations at the wellhead and how to protect workers, especially, but also people downstream from the radon. And as far as social and environmental justice, the county health rankings have just been announced, and they indicate that the counties that are currently slated to be drilled first are those with some of the worst health outcomes already. Broome County ranks 59th of 62 in mortality. Sullivan County, where I come from, ranks 62nd Chemung County is 61st in morbidity. What some of these counties do share is a good physical environment. And though, there are others, for example, in the western part of the state that are also slated to be drilled, they already are suffering from environmental impacts and already have poor health outcomes. They really have nowhere to go as far as further deterioration. However, this is all we have in the southern tier is our environment. And so we should not we can't endanger these people any further because they're already at risk and they're already vulnerable. And to expose them to increased air pollution, increasing truck traffic and accidents and environmental toxins, or displacing them should not be done. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dr. Margaret A. Rafferty. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. As a doctorally prepared nurse educator in continuous practice in New York State since 1975, I wish to emphasize that we simply do not know enough about how the development of unconventional natural gas resources affect human health. Clean air and water are the foundations of our well-being. Contaminating our air and water supply with the toxic chemicals used in this process would compromise these cornerstones of our existence. Pregnant women, infants, children, and the elderly would be especially vulnerable. Even with robust regulation, natural disaster and human error are inevitable. Not enough has been done to study what effect this drilling process has on the health of Americans. Despite calls for more research, funding for the epidemiological studies has not materialized. Meanwhile, some people who live near drilling sites report a host of symptoms, but not one case study appears in the medical literature. No research exists to provide guidance to clinicians. The American Lung Association recently issued a statement that there is irrefutable evidence of serious threats to human health from air pollution emitted during oil and natural gas production. According to the DEC, drilling companies have disclosed the use of 322 unique chemicals in 235 products in our state. The identity of some of the fracturing chemicals that will be used in New York State remains unknown. Some of the pending bills require disclosure of the chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing. Full disclosure would help practicing clinicians make diagnostic decisions. Several prominent physicians, including Dr. Bernard Goldstein, a member of the National Academies of Science Institute of Medicine, have demanded full disclosure of these chemicals, some of which are known neurotoxins, carcinogens, and endocrine disruptors. Dr. Theo Coburn, the co-author of one of the few peer-reviewed articles on natural gas drilling, cited a broad range of potential toxicity of the chemicals deployed. Over 75% of the chemicals could affect the skin, eyes, sensory organs, respiratory system, and GI system. 25% could cause cancer and mutations. 37% of the chemicals could affect the endocrine system, and almost half could affect the nervous, immune, and cardiovascular system or the kidneys. Some examples of these chemicals are benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, ethyl glycol, glutaraldehyde, and other biocides, hydrochloric acid, and hydrogen-treated light petroleum distillates. To make matters worse, nothing is known about the synergistic effects of mixing hydraulic fracturing chemicals with the metals and radioactive materials that exist naturally in the shale rock. As more health professionals become aware of public health implications of unconventional drilling, many have voiced concerns. A number of my fellow health professionals in New York State comment on the SGICE report that it did not have a health impact assessment. I share that concern. Therefore, I support S6772 Avella. That has my strong support. In closing, I urge the application of the precautionary principle. There is no credible medical evidence that high-volume hydraulic fracturing is safe. I ask the New York State Senate to urge the DEC to delay permitting until scientists and other healthcare professionals deem this activity to be medically safe until its impact on human health better understood.
I agree with Dr. Rafferty. I would like
Speaking to the mic.
All right, thank you. I'd like to thank Senator Avella and Rebecca Sheehan for this opportunity to address this forum and echo Senator Avella and Senator Sampson's cogent comments about needing hard facts when considering the issue of hydrologic fracking. My name is Andrew Unger, and I'm a physician who specializes in the care of sick newborns. And while I presently practice in Pennsylvania, where there's a lot of fracking, I was born at Flower Fifth Avenue on 100th Street in Manhattan and grew up in New York City, and I still vacation in the Finger Lakes, and I love New York. And we don't, as Senator Adabo noted, we don't want to wait for something bad to happen. Now, there are two different major kinds of adverse effects that will inevitably occur should an intensive program of unconventional hydrofracturing be undertaken in the shale gas regions of New York State. And I think it's good to think of these somewhat separately. The first of these adverse effects can best be summarized and categorized as quality of life degradation. Unconventional hydrofracturing destroys wildlife habitat, consumes and dirties large volumes of fresh, clean water, it spoils the view, and it fragments ecosystems. The drilling equipment is noisy, and truck traffic kicks up lots of dust. Significant as all of this is, the focus of my testimony is not on quality of life issues, however important, but rather on the direct threats to public health from hydrofracturing. I agree with Senator Perkins that the most underemphasized threat from this technique of energy extraction is air pollution. Air pollution kills people. Smoking is a whole lot of air pollution for a long time. The rates of heart disease and the rates of lung disease are higher when there is air pollution, and that's what people die of. And this methane gas does not come out of the ground pure. Rather, a whole array of volatile organic compounds, particularly the so-called BTEX chemicals, come to the surface in large quantities first through the wellhead whenever a shale gas well is tapped. These BTEX chemicals, benzene, in particular toluene, ethyl benzene, and xylene, as Dr. Rafferty noted, are extremely toxic to humans. Benzene in particular is a potent carcinogen. Benzene exposure causes leukemia. There's no controversy about this. Benzene causes leukemia. That's why they don't use it in high school as a solvent anymore in the chemistry lab. Without proper disposal of the BTEX chemicals, which is very difficult, an epidemic of acute myelogenous leukemia is likely to occur after a 5 to 15-year lag period for oncogenesis in heavily fractured areas. Therefore, I propose, in harmony with Senate 4616 and Senate 6772, that the New York State Department of Health develops the technology to assess the blood specimens already being obtained from the infants born in New York State to screen for diseases and screen these babies for exposure to benzene prospectively. A relatively simple modification of current analytic technique should suffice to determine whether newborns in New York State currently are being exposed to toxic quantities of benzene, and if they are not, to ensure that that remains the case. Of note, the normal or so-called presumptive negative newborn blood specimens already are being carefully stored by the Department of Health for 27 years, as a matter of fact, but not being evaluated for any particular purpose. Research to improve upon that situation would be minimal risk, inexpensive to perform, and require little more than an opt-out option for parents, as well as public education to implement. However, the potential public health benefits of prospective monitoring of the hydrologic fracturing industry for benzene release are, by contrast, immense. Citizens of the Empire State, ceterum censeo, I've always wanted to say that, I urge you to support the passage of Senate 4616 and Senate 6772, and to use that legislation to help fund research that will help prevent benzene, a known carcinogen associated with unconventional hydrofracturing, from unwittingly poisoning our state's children.
Senator Kruger.
I don't know. Senator Avella and I know, feel so strongly that you are right. But again, I appreciate this panel highlighting something we have been talking about. We better find out what the health impacts are. And so some of you have been submitting materials to me privately, so thank you very much for all the material you continue to submit. But seriously, why would the state not allow this to happen without knowing the health impacts in advance? And why would we allow a new industry to start up that we know for a fact would be poisoning people under the current model they're using?
I mean, you have to be like the guy from the Hulu ad in order not to support finding out whether we're giving babies cancer.
That's why your testimony is so important, because we've been saying this. It's good to hear from everybody else to say the same thing. It really is incredible when you think about it. Not to get on the soapbox at this point, but as Senator Kruger said, the fact that we will possibly go ahead with this procedure without knowing the health impacts is insane, is absolutely insane. I want to thank you for your testimony. Next panel.
Okay, for the next panel, we'd like to call Kate Sending from the NRDC, David Van Leuven from Environment New York, Brendan Woodruff from NYPIRG, and Mr. Arthur Kuipers. Again, I apologize for mispronunciation. Mr. Kuipers will be reading into the record testimony from Professor Robert Howarth.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Senator Avella, and thanks to the Democratic Conference for having today's forum, for your environmental leadership, and for your sponsorship of critically important legislation regarding the risks of hydraulic fracturing. My name is Kate Sending. I'm a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. We thank and commend you for taking the risks of fracking head-on and introducing a significant number of pieces of important legislation directed at those risks. While the DEC is still engaged in its ongoing review under SECRA, pursuant to which a de facto moratorium continues to be in effect on high-volume hydraulic fracturing, there are a number of important actions that the legislature can take now to address threats presented not just by proposed new fracking, but by so-called low-volume fracking that is already occurring in New York today. In my 3 minutes, I'm going to just focus on one of those threats, one that we believe to be among the most vexing and inadequately considered by DEC to date, and one that we believe renders it impossible for New York State to responsibly move forward with proposed new fracking. And that's the problem of wastewater generation and management. DEC, through the revised draft SGICE, estimates that proposed high-volume fracking in the Marcellus Shale Formation would generate enormous quantities of wastewater on the order of tens or even hundreds of billions of gallons over the next few decades. Moreover, as you undoubtedly know, that wastewater will be contaminated with a slew of contaminants, ranging from the chemicals used in frac fluid, many of them toxic, which return to the surface as flowback, to naturally occurring heavy metals, volatile organic compounds, total dissolved solids or salts, and radioactive materials in produced water. To compound matters, As NRDC will be highlighting in a forthcoming report on wastewater issues in the Marcellus region, the limited options for how to manage this toxic wastewater represent a menu of unappetizing, if not wholly unacceptable options. There are essentially 4 available management approaches. First, wastewater can be shipped out of state for deep well injection. This necessitates huge amounts of truck traffic on what would already be severely overburdened local roads and presents the risk of earthquakes in the receiving state, likely Ohio. Second, it can be sent to publicly or privately owned treatment facilities and discharged into the state's waterways. In no instance should publicly owned treatment works be allowed to accept the waste. If for no other reason, and there are other reasons, then that many of them are already near, at, or over capacity, and so accepting fracking wastewaters would render them unable to deal with municipal sewage properly. Technologies associated with removing the contaminants at privately owned facilities, including the extraordinarily high levels of salts, are energy intensive in their own right, implicating impacts that must be further evaluated. Third, it can be spread on roads for dust or ice suppression. In no case should this be permitted in New York. It makes no sense at all. The groundwater contamination risks from the high levels of salt alone are simply too great for this to be a reasonable approach. Lastly, it can be recycled or reused. While this option has some appeal on its face, the fact is that the technology does not yet exist to meaningfully recycle the highly salty produced water that constitutes a significant portion of the overall waste stream. And again, the energy intensity associated with technologies to remove the high levels of salt so that it could be reused are inadequately understood and have not been evaluated. Yet DEC has no plan as to how to address these projected huge volumes of toxic wastewater. None. Rather, DEC has taken the position that it's not necessary to evaluate how wastewater will be managed or the inevitable impacts associated with any of the presently dissatisfactory management options in the context of a generic environmental impact statement. They will wait and see, they say, what the companies propose to do with the wastewater in their applications and then figure it out. Even assuming, for the sake of argument only, that that was legally appropriate, it's terrible policy. Simply put, in the absence of any viable plan for addressing the huge projected quantities of toxic fracking wastes, New York State is not prepared to move forward with any proposed new fracking. Fortunately, there is action that the legislature can take now that would not only begin to put some protections in place, but would also address the liquid and solid waste already being generated through ongoing fracking in New York. Senator Avella, your bill, 4616, would remove the existing regulatory loophole that exempts gas development wastes from the legal definition of hazardous waste, making what are, in fact, hazardous wastes subject to the state's cradle-to-grave regulatory program. We urge the Senate to quickly take up and pass SB 4616, which has already passed in the Assembly. The legislature also can and should enact a formal moratorium on any new fracking, which would give DEC the opportunity to fully and properly consider not only the risks presented by toxic wastewater generation and management, but the full suite of threats attendant to fracking, something that they have not yet done. Senate Bill 6261 would do just that, and again, we urge its swift passage. Thank you again, Senator Avella and Senator Krueger, for your leadership on these issues. Thank you to the Democratic Conference and for the opportunity to testify today.
Good afternoon. My name is Brendan Woodruff. I'm the Hydrofracking campaign organizer for the New York Public Interest Research Group. NYPIRG is New York State's largest nonpartisan research and advocacy organization, and we have long been active in protecting New York's health and environment. We commend you for holding this forum here today. We believe the gas extraction method proposed for the Marcellus Shale and other low permeable gas reservoirs, known as high-volume horizontal hydrofracking, better known as hydrofracking or fracking, carries a potentially huge public health and environmental price tag. In response to this gas extraction method, the Department of Environmental Conservation agreed to update its 1992 regulations. However, the revised draft supplemental generic environmental impact statement does not protect New York's health and environment. It does not fulfill the executive order requirements calling for further review. Latest reports indicate that DEC received more than 60,000 comments on the revised ESCAs, and New Yorkers' concern that the environmental review is inadequate and incomplete is well-founded. Of particular concern, the draft plan is, it does not address cumulative impacts. The proposed gas drilling should be considered an action in its entirety when added to other past, present, and reasonably foreseeable actions. It does not assess public health impacts. Despite the growing evidence of risks to public health in requests from over 250 medical and public health professionals, there is no assessment of the potential public health impacts from fracking. It does not classify drilling waste as hazardous waste, although much of the drilling wastewater meets the state's requirements for hazardous waste. However, the Senate has the opportunity to close this loophole with the passage of S 4616. It allows drilling wastewater to be sent to treatment plants, yet currently no plant is designed to handle the water now laden with toxic chemicals. It does not ban the use of toxic chemicals. While DEC has agreed to disclose the chemicals, there is no ban on dangerous chemicals. The setbacks from drinking water supplies sunset and/or can be waived. There's no detailed explanation for how the various setback distances were set or the scientific basis for the proposed setbacks. It does not adequately protect New York City's drinking water infrastructure by allowing drilling dangerously close to many of the aging aqueducts and tunnels that deliver water to the city. It does not adequately analyze the impacts to local roads and infrastructure, and town taxpayers may have to foot the bill to cover the costs of drilling-related damages. Impacts to local emergency workers were also not adequately addressed. First responders' risk of exposure to toxins is increased, and many local service units are ill-equipped to handle industrial emergencies. Therefore, in consideration of the aforementioned, we believe the DEC should rescind this revised draft SGICE and instead fulfill the requirements of Executive Order Number 41. We believe all of these risks are unacceptable. Everyone deserves to have safe, clean drinking water and a healthy environment. We must make sure all New Yorkers are protected from the dangers of fracking. Thank you for providing me the opportunity to testify before you today.
Before you give your testimony, I just want to recognize that we've been joined by State Senator Serrano.
Good morning. My name is Arthur Kuipers. I'm here to present the statements of Robert Howarth. I'm here to present the statements of Robert Howarth, PhD, who's David Atkins Professor of Ecology and Environmental Biology at Cornell University. His comments relate to the EPA emission standards and shale gas. What are the consequences on the greenhouse gas footprint of shale gas of new emission standards being imposed by the EPA on methane and other volatile organics at the time of well completion? These new standards are an important step that will significantly reduce methane emissions and therefore the greenhouse gas footprint of shale gas. Overall, according to the estimates of Howarth et al. 2011 and of EPA 2011, the regulations, if they can be strictly enforced, will reduce total methane emissions from shale gas development by approximately 1/3, considering the entire life cycle from well to final delivery of gas. However, even with these regulations, methane emissions will remain significant, with the estimates of EPA in 2011 and Howarth et al. 2011 indicating the likely leakage of 2.5% to 3.9% of the amount of methane produced over the lifetime of a shale gas well, and possibly as high as 6%. These ongoing emissions result from chronic leakages at the well site, as well as chronic leakages and purposeful venting associated with gas storage, transmission through high-pressure pipeline, and distribution to consumers. The greenhouse gas footprint of shale gas will remain larger than that of coal when viewed over an integrated 20-year time period following emission to the atmosphere because of methane emissions, even though reduced. The July 2011 report from the United Nations and the January 2012 paper by Schindel et al. In Science both stress the urgent need to reduce methane emissions globally, beginning immediately. Without stringent methane control, the global temperature is predicted to reach potentially dangerous levels which may well lead to runaway global warming within the next 15 to 40 years. The natural gas industry will remain the largest single source of methane pollution in the U.S., responsible for almost 40% of total human-controlled methane emissions, even with the new EPA regulations. This information is based on the background paper prepared by Robert Howarth of Cornell, Drew Schindel of NASA Goddard Space Institute, Renee Santoro of Cornell, Anthony Ingraffia of Cornell, Nathan Phillips of Boston University, and Amy Townsend Small of the University of Cincinnati, prepared for the U.S. National Climate Assessment. and it is based entirely on information in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. Thank you.
I want to thank you for taking the time to read that into the record. The author couldn't be with us here today, but I do appreciate that. Any questions from my colleagues?
More comment. I mean, because with, with NRDC focusing on the wastewater, which I think, again, all of us agree, whereas it was like oh, surprise, one more thing we didn't really understand enough about when we first gave the DEC the assignment, but you highlighted, all the efforts people are making to try to understand the risks of wastewater and the dilemmas of not handling it properly and the experiences of Pennsylvania. And then a couple of weeks ago, I read a blog saying, oh, they're selling it to spread on the streets in New York State. And I thought, really, what are we doing? I mean, why are we even trying to go through all this? Like, oops, we don't have to worry about it because you can just dump it on the roads and get away with it. So I think it highlights, so thank you, but it highlights also the dangers of allowing us to go forward at all, because there are so many unintended consequences of every step in this process. And for me, that was just, the most absurd, almost like you thought you were laughing in a sort of sick feeling in your stomach, like, oh, who imagined we were selling it to spread out there? Why do we have to worry about it leaking into our groundwater? Right, because we're selling it to dump right on our right above our groundwater. So mostly thank you very much, all of you, for your testimony.
Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Okay, the next panel, Kate Hudson from Riverkeeper, Martha Robertson, Tompkins County Legislator, Julie Huntsman, Town of Otsego, Councilwoman.
Okie dokie. Senator Avella and Senator Kruger and Senator Serrano, thank you so much for being here. I really wanted to acknowledge everybody by name, but it's been a roving cast and it had to take forever. As she said, I'm Julie Huntsman. I'm a veterinarian and town councilwoman from the town of Otsego. And I must mention, we're the first rural New York town to ban fracking. Thank you. I ran for office to continue my work to ensure that no one in our town would ever have to worry about their water being fouled and property devalued from gas drilling and hydrofracking. There's no more pressing issue than this topic, and I'm thankful every day for the good water from the 2 wells on my property. I don't take it for granted. Clearly, it is not. Clearly and sadly, it is not. I have great hopes that the scores of New York towns that have passed bans or moratoria, mine included, will have a trickle-up effect, that our state legislators and our governor will get what town after town is saying. Based on overwhelming evidence from numerous states and the facts about the drilling and hydrofracking process, these towns are embracing the very common sense precautionary principle. Will you not respect the will of the people and the integrity of local democracy and at least clarify our legislature's stance on home rule as regards this issue? I do thank Senator Jim Seward for stepping up to do just that, and I wish he were here now, along with Senator Ball. As a very minimum, please support his home rule bill. It's the right thing to do regardless of your stance on drilling. It's about respect for democracy. The gas industry's attempts to claim supersedure over every town's right to make basic land use decisions is absolutely ludicrous and wrong. But ensuring that our health and welfare and that of future generations, including all the animals that we steward, ensuring that that comes before corporate profits is good governance and common sense. Let me be clear, I am not anti-growth or anti-industry. I support responsible land use and agricultural practices. But fracking is not farming, regardless of Penn State's stance that is just another aspect of ag science. We're living in a time where residents in Texas, for instance, in or near heavily drilled areas, are now being advised to have baseline levels of VOCs measured in their blood and urine. This is in addition to the all-important pre-drilling water testing we must do, and don't stop there. Better do some air quality testing, and don't forget the radon levels in your house. This uncomfortable acceptance that we simply must do all this pre-testing reflects a cultural assumption that what's to come will most assuredly harm us. And that's based on overwhelming evidence that it does. This is insane, so why allow it? Clearly, some major changes at the national level must be made. This method of energy extraction may be expedient and legal, but it is grossly irresponsible. The infamous Halliburton loophole exempting this industry from federal environmental safeguards must be overturned. To do this, Congress needs to pass the FRACT Act and BREATHE Act. But where is the political will for this kind of basic common sense reform? My Congressman Richard Hanna said the FRAC Act would never come up for a vote. Well, thanks a lot. How are we going to create the political will? Right now, our New York towns are doing all they can to work in the best interest of their residents, and that means banning drilling. So what's your next step? I'm speaking to the choir here. Y'all are wonderful. Everybody should support Senator Avella's bill. New York needs to lead in this. The nation is looking to us to lead, and let's all do our part. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Martha Robertson, Chair of the Legislature in Tompkins County, but with permission, I'd like to read a statement first from someone else who wanted to be here but couldn't come. He was ill today. Richard Driscoll is the supervisor from the town of Newfield, also in Tompkins County. I'm Richard Driscoll, well, obviously I'm not, but the supervisor of the town of Newfield, a small and beautiful town which spans the Susquehanna and St. Lawrence watersheds south of Cayuga Lake. We are 5,000 residents with a budget under $2 million. Our recent tax cap experience had us scraping the bone by the time we were done. We're a parsimonious board, but 2013 under the tax cap looms in a dreadful way with horizontal hydrofracking on the horizon. Referencing the Oppenheimer bill, municipalities need legally the ability to regulate the impact of drilling on our municipal assets. A case in point, DOT law must specify that we can regulate our roads rather than being silent. The DOT must come into coordination with DEC, which only suggests the gas drillers secure road use agreements before applying for a permit. This non-arrangement exposes municipalities to budget-breaking stress should we face the repair or replacement of our roads due to heavy industrial traffic. The state must enact a severance tax, and municipalities must be included in revenue collection for the expenses each will incur as a result of the many impacts this industrial activity will have on our budgets. And to establish a fund, the state must establish a fund to pay any expenses we may face as a result of this drilling practice, the damage of which may not become apparent for years to come. I'm talking about Hooker Chemical and Love Canal. I'm not talking about revenue sharing from Albany. I emphasize here that the state's severance tax should be assessed off the top and before the local property taxes are calculated. Ad valorem should not be considered a deductible from the severance tax. The state must set up a fund to reimburse towns for expenses that occur leading up to and during the drilling process, since any severance or ad valorem tax will occur only when the gas begins to flow and only from those wells that produce, which on average is about 10 to 20% of wells drilled, and only after a lag time of 18 to 36 months from the beginning of the process. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today. And now my own statement. First, I want to extend my sincere thanks to all three of you, especially to Senator Avella and the legislators who have pulled together the forum and the legislation that we're discussing today. However, in my 3 minutes, I can't possibly evaluate these bills adequately. I'll simply urge you to make use of the rest of your session and pass the strongest possible package that you can. We at the local level have been lobbying Albany about hydrofracking since the days of Governor Patterson and Commissioner Granis. And during those years, we've been told by both parties, in both houses, and by both governors, we're waiting for the DEC process to be finished. In fact, Senator Tom O'Mara, who just met us outside in the hallway, did come and listen for a little while, and he repeated that, and we were waiting for the DEC, but at least he came to listen for a little while. I appreciate that. But given the 66,000 comments on the revised ESCITES, it's not likely the DEC will complete their process before the end of your session in June. However, there's every reason to expect that they will do so and begin issuing permits before you next meet in January. Therefore, now is the time for the legislature to act or risk becoming irrelevant altogether. Once permitting begins, it will be harder, even harder, to exert legislative oversight. We have only to watch Pennsylvania for evidence of that failure. That's called closing the barn door after the cows have gone. However, we are told that most, if not all, of these bills will not come to the Senate floor for a vote. In fact, this proceeding is a forum, not a hearing, because of Chairperson Grisanti's unwillingness for the ENCON committee to even consider these bills. Will this body be silent about one of the most critical issues of our day? Hydrofracking touches virtually all aspects of our lives. Who owns our land and decides how it's used? Economic winners and losers, crime and homelessness, our ability to get a mortgage and homeowners insurance, who lives and works in our neighborhoods, the water we drink, the air we breathe, and nothing less than the shaking of the earth itself and the fate of our ever-warming planet. And this isn't just about a few counties. The Utica Shale is far larger than the Marcellus, covering most of New York State. Moreover, water, air, and truck traffic flow far beyond any particular drill pad. And now we know injection wells cause earthquakes. Now that we know that, corporations will be looking to Long Island to dispose of their wastewater. As Kate said, they're looking for the plants that do exist are in Long Island. Will the New York State Legislature leave this mighty debate up to the governor and his executive agency? You and many of your colleagues have done so much important work in crafting legislation that will have profound impacts on people's lives. Please don't let it die on the shelf. Fracking is not a partisan issue. Unfortunately, it would appear so from the people who've come to listen to us today. However, our legislature, bipartisan legislature, passed a strong resolution calling for a statewide ban, and that included 2 out of the 3 Republicans on the board. There are bills worth supporting that are sponsored by both parties. I've given Democratic lawn signs to Republican farmers who are tired of gas corporations pushing them around. I've also argued with Democratic union members hungry for work in our upstate communities. New Yorkers have been debating fracking for years now. We've been waiting for our government to join us in that debate and do something. That is not to say that any action is better than no action. We must have true protection, and the bills before us today are the kinds of tools we need. I recognize this is precisely why you scheduled this forum, Senator Avella. So my question goes to 2 men who are not here, Chair Grisante and Leader Skelos. If you block these bills from even coming to the floor for debate, I have to ask, why are you all here? This is your job. This is your responsibility. And it's not good enough to cram 30 bills into 2 days at the end of June. These issues demand your full attention, and we have a right to hear your public debate. New Yorkers deserve no less. Senator Avella, I applaud your leadership on this issue and your determination not to let it be ignored. If the leadership of your House will not bring these bills to the floor, please find another way. We are depending on you. Thank you.
You're going to have a tough time beating that.
Thank you to the Senate Democratic Conference for giving Riverkeeper, who I represent, an opportunity to testify today. on Senate legislative proposals. My name is Catherine Hudson. I'm the Watershed Program Director for Riverkeeper. We are actively involved in advocacy and public education surrounding the issues of shale gas extraction via hydraulic fracturing and its potential impacts on New York City's water supply. Legislative action on the issue of hydrofracking is imperative given the substantial flaws and omissions in the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation revised draft SGEIS and significant gas industry exemptions that exist in New York state regulations. My written testimony focuses on 4 areas where legislative action is urgently needed, specifically a health impact assessment, the closure of a regulatory loophole that currently excludes the gas industry from hazardous waste requirements, clarification of home rule authority, and a moratorium on the issuance of high-volume hydrofracking permits for at least a year to provide DEC with the time necessary to address the serious deficiencies with the revised draft supplemental generic environmental impact statement. There is a significant opportunity for the Senate to act in concert with the Assembly with respect to at least 3 of these bills. The Assembly has proposed legislation, in fact passed legislation with respect to the hazardous waste loophole, and is considering legislation with respect to home rule authority and a moratorium. It would be a wonderful thing if you could act in concert with the Assembly. I would like, however, today to focus my limited comments, oral comments, on the need for an independent health impact assessment. Hydrofracking poses more than just environmental risks. It is a human health issue. And the New York State Legislature should mandate an independent health impact assessment on hydrofracking. DEC declined to include an assessment of potential health impacts in the scope of the RDSGEIS that was prepared in 2009, despite the growing body of evidence across the country that shale gas extraction operations are making people sick. Residents living near shale gas operations have reported health issues ranging from dizziness, bronchitis, respiratory symptoms, to nausea, fatigue, headaches, anxiety, difficulty concentrating, and cancer. In March, a study from the Colorado School of Public Health found that cancer risks were 66% higher for residents living less than half a mile from oil and gas wells than from those living further away, with benzene being the major contributor to the increased risk. This same study highlights the fact that chronic exposure to ozone prevalent at gas production sites can lead to asthma and pulmonary diseases, particularly in children and the aged. The medical community in New York has warned the governor not to allow hydrofracking to go forward without understanding its health impacts. In October of 2011, 250 physicians and medical professionals wrote a letter to Governor Cuomo calling for a comprehensive public health impact assessment. In December, Dr. Sandra Steingraber, Lois Gibbs, and Fran Drescher echoed the call with 19 New York-based cancer advocacy groups in a letter to Governor Cuomo asking for the same assessment, and federal health officials, including the director of the National Center for Environmental Health of the Centers for Disease Control, has said that more research is required. And in fact, there has been a precedent for it in the Colorado health study and in one done in Alaska. New York has the opportunity to set the bar equally high as these other states when it comes to the health of its residents. Riverkeeper therefore strongly supports Senate Bill 6772, which would require the SUNY School of Public Health to undertake a health impact assessment for high-volume hydrofracking and suspend the issuance of all permits for hydrofracking until such an assessment is finalized. In addition, we would like to point out that a moratorium is necessary and linked with such a health impact assessment. DEC has indicated that it may finalize the SGIS as early as this summer. Such an action on DEC's part would be completely unacceptable given its State Environmental Quality Review Act obligations and the critical emissions in the RDSGEIS that still need to be addressed. The governor has insisted that science will determine if New York State allows industrial gas drilling by means of high-volume hydrofracking to go forward. But he is breaking this pledge by failing to gather all the facts before making a decision. The legislature has the opportunity to slow down this process by putting a moratorium in place, which would allow DEC to address the serious emissions in the SGIS, including the failure to consider health impacts, address wastewater disposal issues, and economic impacts, which unfortunately I do address in my written testimony. I don't have time to address orally today. For these reasons, Riverkeeper supports Senate Bill 6261, which would suspend the issuance of permits until June of 2013, in addition to Senate Bill 6772, which would suspend issuance of permits until a health impact assessment is complete. Thank you, Senator Avella and Senator Krueger, for your leadership on this significant issue. And thank you for the Senate Democratic Conference for the opportunity to participate in today's forum. And we look forward to continuing to work with the Senate on this incredibly important issue.
Let's applaud it. I want to thank you for your testimony. You know, this goes not only for your testimony, but for everybody that's been here and will testify. Your voice is going to be heard beyond this forum. Your voice is being heard on the other side of the aisle, too. And I would hesitate to think that the governor is going to hear this testimony and your voice. And hopefully, by all working together, we can come up with the moratorium, the health impact, and of course, you know what my personal opinion is. I don't want to do hydrofracking at all, but at least put us in the position to have. Who was that? That was actually what I came up with, 42-20 or fight. That's the ban bill. But at the very least, there are some minimum things that could be done. So I appreciate your testimony. Any comments? No? Good.
Senator, if I could answer a couple questions from before.
Sure.
Senator Squadron asked about other safer ways to do this. We've started hearing about gas fracking with liquid propane that supposedly uses no water, so there are fewer trucks. There's only one company that's been doing this in Canada. There's absolutely no environmental analysis that's been done. The only information that's out there is from this company. So if somebody, and the Tioga County Landowners Coalition is touting this as a great solution, be very afraid of this. This is, first off, it's another fossil fuel to get a fossil fuel. I don't get it, but there is absolutely no independent analysis of gas fracking, and that should just be the idea that, and there has been some public relations from the DEC saying that, well, it's not really hydrofracking, so we don't have to study it, we can start permitting. Resist that at all costs.
If I may comment, we're actually going to amend my ban bill to include that process as well.
And another question, just about why would Governor Cuomo be in favor of this? There's, we have an economic problem in upstate New York. We need jobs. The quickest way to put people to work is to advertise the on-bill financing that you've already put in place so that every homeowner could get insulation put into their house. Every homeowner could get, windows caulked and fixed. If we put people to work, putting conservation measures into place, we'd have those jobs. We would reduce our carbon footprint. One of the other true dangers of gas drilling is, anybody who's interested in making money in this, I don't know what their hurry is anyway. The price is so low, it seems you really want to just wait. But the price is so low, it's also forcing people to defer or just look away from renewables or conservation. It's making the economic payback even longer. So there is no bridge to a renewable future. It removes the bridge altogether. So it's just the complete wrong direction for this country to go in.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Senator Avella, could I just make one comment? What would you have us out there in the hinterlands, the grassroots activists, some of whom have turned into politicians now, what would you have us do? We know if you were king, you would say, this nasty technology is banned, but these other bills, where can we be most effective to help you?
Well, I personally think that you have to get to the governor. I really think that's where the battle is. So if it's whether you support the ban bill or the health impact assessment bill or any of the other bills, there are two people that you have to really get to at this point. That's the governor and the majority leader of the Senate, Senator Skelos.
Yeah. Okay.
If we were to pass something in the Senate, I think the governor would be put in such a position that he'd have to go along with it.
Okay.
If the governor would support it, I think Dean Skelos would be hard-pressed not to support it. So either one of those two people, if they would break on this issue, in my opinion, would go a long way in
Okay.
getting where we want to be.
Which bill or bills do you think have the greatest chance of getting passed in the Senate?
Well, I would say the hazardous waste is
Okay.
crucial. The hazardous waste bill and the health impact assessment.
How
Those
about
are the-
home rule?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. All right, because we need
Yeah.
focus. We don't have unlimited
Yeah.
time or energy, so that's helpful. Thank you.
Senator Serrano has a question, and then Senator Kruger.
Well, I think I have an answer also. Is that okay? Because you said you ran for office.
Yes, ma'am.
On this issue.
I did.
So when politicians aren't doing the right thing for people, this is democracy.
That's right.
We're
Yes.
supposed to vote in people who will do the right thing. So I completely respect your willingness to run for office on this issue, and apparently you won?
I did, big.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
You know, we're not supposed to talk partisan politics, but we can talk politics here. You know, the state government needs to be responsive to communities and the people in communities. And as so many people have already testified today, this could be the greatest risk to our environment in the 21st century. If that's not worth getting political about, I don't know what is. So thank
And
you.
Senator, if I can say, in our county this past November, in three towns, Democrats took majorities or retained majorities by 60 and 70% on this issue in towns that were majority Republican. So this is, as I said, it's not a partisan issue. And unfortunately, I dare say, redistricting has kind of made it a little bit hard for any opponents to show up at this point who might have a different position. So these things are connected.
Senator Serrano.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank all the speakers. And the discussion here, Senator Avella, I think is very good, very enlightening, and the concerns about health and potential health concerns are extremely troubling, and I'm glad that we're talking about it. But I wanted to jump off something that I think the Riverkeeper testimony touched upon, which is the negative economic impact that faces the state. In the Senate, I'm the ranking member on the committee that oversees state parks. And state parks are really the jewel of the state of New York. We have some of the most fantastic natural wonders anywhere in the world. And my love for state parks, I think, is shared by folks on both sides of the aisle. It's not a partisan issue. But the threat to natural wonders like our state parks is very real when you consider hydrofracking. And the pollution of these pristine areas, places that those of us who live in New York City, who live in the concrete jungle, we travel to places in state parks because we want to get away from the pollution. We want to get away from the chemicals. And I think it's very unfortunate that there is a possibility because of what's going on here that we could, in a very real way, damage these wonderful state parks and have a very real negative impact because the tourism sector in New York State is a tremendous revenue enhancement for our communities, and state parks is a major draw. I'm concerned about the impact that this would have on state park tourism, on environmental tourism, and New York State tourism as a whole. Thank you.
That's tremendous. We need to stay a brand with an abundance of riches. And for the folks downstate, I think they like to come up and pick apples and, blueberries and pet cows and that kind of stuff. And we love to have you there, come to the museums in Cooperstown. But if this fracking takes hold, who's going to want to come up there?
Right.
New York needs to be branded like Vermont. You think they'd allow this? Heck no. The green state. They're branded as clean and green and agriculture, and we need to keep that and not blow it for all this baloney. Okay, I'm done.
And I think just in response to Senator Avella's point, which is that the point is to really communicate to the governor. The governor has been hanging on to the idea that this is important for the state's economy. And disabusing the governor and everybody else that believes that that's true is incredibly important. This is going to be an economic downside, not an economic upside, to parts of the state that are critical, not only recreation and tourism, but agriculture and small business. New York State is the third largest producer of organic produce in the country. And we're already hearing from co-ops in New York City that they will not buy organic produce from the southern tier if hydrofracking begins. And so we are, even the argument that we need this for the economy is flawed.
If I can add a couple of things,
we do have a number of speakers to go on, and I'm going to have to cut you off. Because otherwise we're not going to get to everybody. But I do appreciate your testimony. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to call the next panel. Ellen Weininger, Pat Wood, Catherine Bein-Kaffner, again, apologies for pronunciation, and Paul Rubin.
And you'll have to excuse some of us. We're going to start eating lunch while we're taking testimony, since right from here we'll be going into session. So.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Avella, for convening this hearing on a matter that is of utmost urgency to all New Yorkers. My name is Ellen Weininger. I'm the Educational Outreach Coordinator for Grassroots Environmental Education. Grassroots Environmental Education is an environmental health nonprofit focused on the relationship between environmental toxins and human health. We are particularly concerned about children's unique vulnerability to toxic exposures due to their immature organs and developing bodies, making it more difficult for them to eliminate certain toxins. Due to their size, children receive proportionally greater doses of chemical contaminants found in air, water, and food. Even a small exposure occurring during a critical window of a child's development could result in permanent adverse health outcomes. We are very concerned about high-volume slick water hydraulic fracturing for natural gas extraction and its effects its widespread use will have on the people of New York State, especially young children. Contamination of our air, water, and soil are inherent risks in the fracking process and therefore unacceptable by any standard. We've already heard countless testimonies regarding the various impacts on potential impacts on water, the certainty of air pollution, the issues of wastewater disposal and radon, and also our food supply. So I will just take an excerpt from my written testimony to present to you orally. Despite those serious threats to public health and the environment from fracking operations and glaring flaws and gaps in the skies, the document states that shale gas development would provide substantial economic and environmental benefits, and I emphasize benefits, and not harvesting this important energy source would be contrary to New York State and national interests. Furthermore, and producing in-state natural gas would contribute to meeting climate change, public health, and environmental objectives. This utterly false statement was used by the New York State DEC to reject the no action alternative in section 9.1, which would prohibit permitting of high volume horizontal hydraulic fracturing and shale gas development in this state. This begs the question, what are we doing here? This claim this claim of substantial economic and environmental benefits, public health benefits, and so forth are baseless and does not factor in public costs, which have already been outlined, and dismisses the inherent risks that shale gas development poses to New York State's air, water, and land, which cannot be mitigated. In fact, this evidence would lead us to the opposite conclusion, which would be to exercise the alternative of no action. So I'd like to, we would very much be grateful to hold the New York State DC accountable for where's the evidence for these claims. The public health costs have been covered as an issue that has been a glaring omission in the SGICE, not only around contaminated food supplies, public health care costs regarding water pollution and air pollution, but also special education needs costs of impacts on children with regard to those health care costs. Children are our most vulnerable population, and they are not considered nor mentioned in the SGICE. It's already been stated that numerous medical associations and healthcare groups and health advocacy groups have already signed on to numerous letters, given testimony, and countless warnings to the governor, the DOH, and the DEC, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, and also the recent call for a national moratorium by a group of leading medical experts. A comprehensive health impact assessment should be conducted and led by independent public health experts in an open public process in cooperation with the New York State Legislature. We support S6772 Avella. We'd also like to take note, have the panel take note that in 2010, the President's Cancer Panel, in its annual report recommendations to government, industry, and healthcare professionals, stated opportunities for eliminating or minimizing cancer-causing and cancer-promoting environmental exposures must be acted upon to protect all Americans, but especially children. They are at special risk due to their smaller body mass and rapid physical development, both of which magnify their vulnerability to known or suspected carcinogens. Numerous environmental contaminants can cross the placental barrier to a disturbing extent. Babies are born pre-polluted. Children can also be harmed by genetic or other damage resulting from environmental exposure sustained by the mother and, in some cases, the father. A recent analysis by Dr. Leo Trasande, published in the journal Health Affairs, was updated, and that recent report found that the costs of environmentally triggered diseases such as childhood cancer, asthma, neurological disorders is now at $76.6 billion as of 2008 per year for children alone. Dr. Trasande states that the analysis reemphasizes for policymakers the implications of failing to prevent toxic chemical exposures not only for the health of children, but also for the health of the economy. New York State has experienced great success where environmental health issues are concerned. We've worked with other states to our west to protect our air and our land from the air polluting industries. We find industries that illegally dump toxic chemicals into lakes and other bodies of water, and at significant expense, we've restored our great rivers and smaller waterways that have been polluted by industries, and there are countless other examples. In fact, the New York State Advisory Panel on Green Procurement recently voted to approve a guidance policy requiring all New York State agencies to consider avoiding 85 chemicals of concern in products purchased by the state. The hydrofracking process uses a significant number of chemicals from that list that are known or suspected carcinogens, such as benzene, formaldehyde, and naphthalene. If hydrofracking is permitted, New York State residents will be exposed to the very same toxic chemicals that the Green Procurement Executive Order intended to minimize, seriously jeopardizing public health. Positive efforts that have been undertaken to protect the health and safety of the people of New York State have been effective, and this is the kind of environmental protection the people of New York expect from leadership in Albany. The best way to avoid the negative human health and environmental impacts and economic burden of toxic exposures is to avoid them, prevent them, and from ever happening, using the precautionary principle. Children and their parents rely on government officials to provide the protections they need for their health and safety.
Can I
The
ask you to
stakes
sum
are
up?
too high to deliver anything less than the passage of a ban on hydrofracking in New York State, which would also include the ban of fracking waste, which needs to be legally defined as hazardous waste, from being transported from out of state for disposal or use for any other purpose here in New York. Thank you.
Thank you both, Senator Avella and Kruger. I am grateful that you've provided this opportunity for ongoing public discussion on this critical issue. I'm speaking today as the Executive Director of Grassroots Environmental Education. We have offices in Port Washington, Long Island, and Rye, New York. I'm also the co-creator of AMillionFrackingLetters.com and a visiting scholar at Adelphi University teaching in their nursing school. More importantly, I'm a mother who cares deeply about our basic human need to raise our families in communities where our water, air, and land is protected from contamination. Many of us today have raised the idea of the precautionary principle. And if you're unfamiliar, this is a principle that just simply states that when an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. Many decision-making bodies in countries around the world are using this precautionary principle as guidance there. But if we take this to another level, using hydrofracking for natural gas extraction as an example, we could say that when an activity raises threats of permanent harm to human health or the environment, even precautionary measures are not sufficient to protect public health. And we should seek instead, through innovation, better ways to achieve similar goals. Permanent harm may be thought of as permanent contamination of public water supplies and land with hydrofracking chemicals, or contamination through both legal and illegal disposal of used hydrofracking chemicals and the radioactive elements, brine, and toxic metals that may accompany them. Or permanent harm may be thought of as the disease or disability that gets passed down one generation to the next from an environmentally caused genetic mutation. This is the science of epigenetics, which may occur from exposure to one or more of the hydrofracking chemicals or from components of diesel exhaust that are a certainty with active drilling sites. Moving on to another point, I think we can all applaud our governor for prioritizing education and earmarking millions of dollars to improve the current system in our state. He, like many of us, knows that education is the key to success, and it's getting harder and harder to educate our youth. 1 in 6 children has a neurobehavioral disorder or learning disability, from ADD and dyslexia to autism. 1 in 88 children, and these are new statistics as of last month, nationally, and their families suffer from this heartbreaking disorder, lifelong disability, and societal problem of staggering proportion. Much attention is being directed to discovering the links between neurobehavioral problems and toxins in the environment. Many of the chemicals in hydrofracking fluids are linked to neurobehavioral problems. So we encourage our children to graduate high school and to go on to college, ultimately earning higher degrees in science, medicine, law, and other disciplines. We have an abundance of these scholars in our state. They are sprinkled throughout our communities, in our colleges and universities, our hospitals, think tanks, and research centers. It's something that New York should be proud of, and any governor who prioritizes education should be proud of as well. Hundreds of these scholars and medical doctors have felt compelled to weigh in on the debate over hydrofracking without being sought out by the governor, nor the Departments of Environmental Protection or Health. They, along with tens of thousands of others, have spoken through letters, testimony reports, and countless meetings with representatives here in Albany about the dangers of hydrofracking. Hydrogeologists really understand the vulnerability and movement of the water that lies beneath the surface. Biologists understand the loss of habitat, the destruction of ecosystems, and life that is held in the shale. Climate change scientists understand methane and the impact of burning fossil fuels. Electrical engineers understand conservation. And medical doctors and toxicologists understand the vulnerability of the human body when it encounters toxic substances, even in minute amounts, in the air it breathes and the water it drinks. They have all joined together in a historic movement to help enable our state, a national leader, to make the difficult but necessary decision not to allow hydrofracking in New York. They have drawn from their expertise the conclusion that this is a risk we cannot take, and they have shared their expertise without compensation. Certainly our governor cannot dismiss the educated opinions which he publicly admires and wants our children to aspire to and bow to the deep pockets of industry. I urge your colleagues on the other side of the aisle here in Albany to summon all of their strength of character, heed what they teach their children and grandchildren about right and wrong, and make this state once again a place where we do the right thing, where people matter more than money. With the right leadership, we can make our upstate economy grow, in part with new and permanent jobs in clean, renewable energy industries, green chemistry, and sustainable agriculture. We can be an example to the nation that all of this can be accomplished while we provide the basic and life-sustaining resources and a good quality of life for all of our citizens now and for generations to come. Thank you.
Senator Avella and members of the Senate, my name is Paul Rubin, president of HydroQuest. I'm here today with Dr. Beinkopfner of Mid-Hudson Geosciences. HydroQuest and Mid-Hudson Geosciences, two professional hydrogeologic consulting firms, hereby provide detailed written testimony on behalf of the Delaware Riverkeeper Network in support of draft New York State legislation designed to protect New York State's groundwater and freshwater resources. We provide hydrogeologic justification for banning hydraulic fracturing throughout New York State and the Delaware River Basin, part of which is in New York State. Today's gas field technology is not capable of isolating our freshwater aquifers from gas field contaminants. The durability and mechanical properties of gas well sealant materials, primarily cement and steel, are not sufficiently advanced such that freshwater aquifers will be safely protected for even as long as 100 years, much less the hundreds of thousands of years required. Upward hydraulic gradients in failed well bores and along fractures will provide contaminant pathways. In addition, gas production wells placed within seismically active regions where ground shaking and motion will damage the integrity of cement seals will significantly increase the risk of contaminant dispersal upward into overlying aquifers. For this reason, there are no hydrofracking procedures which can assure protection of our finite and vulnerable water resources now or into the future. As a result, toxic and carcinogenic contaminants are already and will continue to move with our groundwater flow systems to our most prolific valley bottom aquifers and rivers. The enormous magnitude of planned gas well installations, thousands, will result in large-scale and widespread water contamination that cannot be remedied. As aptly stated by Sila Allison, PhD, of the Eight Rivers Council in West Virginia, the damage may not show up for years. The ruination of our water may at first be invisible and in the end irreparable. The only viable means of protecting our groundwater and surface water resources now and for future generations is to immediately institute a New York State and Delaware River watershed ban on hydraulic fracturing. Perhaps sometime in the future, alternate sealant technology and non-toxic means of fracturing geologic formations will be developed. Only at that time should consideration be given to permitting hydraulic fracturing for gas and oil extraction. At this time, the only justifiable and scientifically defensible means of protecting New York State's water resources is by enacting S 4220A to 11, which prohibits the use of hydraulic fracturing in the extraction of oil and gas. On behalf of the Delaware Riverkeeper, we implore the Senate and legislature to protect the water resources of the state of New York.
First, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak, as well as hear all of the other speakers and the information that they're providing us. It's quite an enlightenment from just a little hydrogeologist. I wanted to point out, my name is Catherine Beinkaffner. I have a PhD from Syracuse, and my original dissertation at Syracuse involved using thousands of well records from the state of New York. I went through all the files of DEC and built a database, and then I proceeded to map across the southern tier massive faults that seem to be related to décollement structures or sliding along the salt structures and then coming to the surface as faults and fractures, and some of them actually contain gas in the Bass Islands play, which happened to be developing right at the time I was studying all the records. Paul and I have been studying hydrofracking for about 4 years. When we first started out, there was very little information in the literature except for technical methodology of how to do fracking. There was hardly any information, or none virtually, about problems associated with contamination and migration. Paul and I had both been in the petroleum industry, and prior to my going into the industry, I worked at the Geological Survey here in Albany. And my first introduction to hydrofracking was as I worked as an oil and gas geologist at the New York Geological Survey. And at that time, they used water, sand, and walnut hulls to inject under high pressure to open these fractures. Things have changed a lot in the industry by moving to these contaminated types of fracking fluids. Also at that time, there were some injection projects jointly monitored between DEC and the Education Department, the Geological Survey, where we discovered that injecting chemicals under high pressure was not a good idea. And those projects were actually halted because in Colorado at the same time, there were similar projects dealing with military chemicals that were injected into the subsurface and causing micro-earthquakes. So Paul and I started looking for published literature. The first thing we came across was a 2002 paper by Robert Jacoby at the University of Buffalo. He's been studying fractures in New York State for 36 years. And he's got a map that when you look at the state on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, there's a lot of black just showing the lines where all these fractures, faults, and other vertical routes of conveyance for fluids exist in New York State. So here we are already, before we even start fracking, there are fractures. There's another pathway that's significant. All of the old wells that were drilled in the late 1800s, early 1900s, this was long before you needed a permit to drill a well. There's no real records of where all these wells were. So there are a lot of wells, even though DEC has a program to plug and abandon, there are a lot of wells that have never been found and never been plugged. So here are a whole another series of vertical conduits that can move contamination from depth to the surface. Let's see. But these are just before we even get to fracking. So when we get to fracking, then we're busy injecting these fluids under high pressures, and they're going to make more fractures, enlarge the network, increase the permeability, and raise the pressures to like 10,000 pounds per square inch. Now remember, you only put 30 pounds per square inch, or maybe 60 in your car or truck tires. So this is a lot of pressure. There's no way for these fluids to move downward. They can only move upward. So if you're pumping away and pushing this downward, it's got to come up. It's going to find the path of least resistance. You are going to have these fracking fluids and other gas and other fluids in the formation moving upward. I mean, why would we want to allow these chemicals to come to the surface and get into our freshwater aquifers and water supplies? It's insane. Let's see. The use of these toxic chemicals in fracking fluids and the potential for upward flow of contamination of aquifers and surface waters are reason to ban hydrofracking, at least to put a moratorium on it until we figure out if there is any way to actually get at this gas. But for now, I don't see there is a safe way to actually implement hydrofracking or any other form of injection of carbon dioxide or gas under high pressure. You're still going to be creating the same problem. Remember, you've got these radioactive elements in the Marcellus. Those are going to move upward also. And radioactivity is impossible to get out of water. We don't know how to do that. We'd just be creating something we can't see and something we don't know how to deal with it. So as citizens of New York, we implore the legislature to protect the water resources of the people of the state of New York.
Once again, thank you for your testimony. It's been very enlightening, and especially your testimony. So I appreciate that. We do have a number of other speakers left to go. Rebecca's going to keep calling off the panels, but I would ask, because as I mentioned at the beginning of the forum, the forum goes to 3 o'clock because session starts at 3, so that if people from this point on can really keep to the 3 minutes or even go below the 3 minutes, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, the next panel, Neil Woodworth from the Adirondack Mountain Club, Marge Shab, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Susanna Glidden, and Gusty Bogog.
Why don't you start?
Very well. Thank you to the Senate Democratic Conference, Senator Avella, Senator Krueger, Senator Serrano. The Adirondack Mountain Club is here today because we care a great deal about the water resources of the state, and I'm going to talk about public land. We haven't talked about public land, but about 1 million acres of public land is at risk here, and that's land that all of us own. And because DEC, to its credit, has looked at the impact of hydraulic fracturing in other states and concluded that it would not allow the drilling infrastructure on top of state land and state parks, but they're looking for ways to lease that land, lease the gas under those public lands. And the big problem with doing that is twofold. One, we have found through a study of those wildlife management areas, those state forests, again, 1 million acres from the Catskills to Lake Erie, those areas are heavily used for public recreation and heavily used for watershed protection and protection of ecosystems. And the problem, or actually the reality is that private individuals live all around those public lands, and if the state of New York begins to lease the gas under those lands, the infrastructure, all the development of the drill rigs and all the infrastructure that goes with them, including pipelines and compressor stations, inevitably has to go on the private lands that adjoin the public lands and have been voluntarily managed actually to almost double the protected area in New York State from our public woodlands and wildlife management areas. There's another insidious effect of gas leases by the state, and that is we haven't talked today about the compulsory integration statute, but it's time to talk about it because it has a very serious effect on private landowners.